Are we online? Are we live? We're live? We're okay? Okay, hello everybody, I'm Ikibu, the video content manager for World of Tanks Europe. Today we're going to be hosting the Tank Museum, who we're going to have a stream from and do everything right from there across the little river that connects us. We're going to be having some tank action, we're going to be having some Tank Museum action, some historical information, which we'll be sharing soon. We're going to have a bunch of gameplay at the end of the stream, but for the very first part of it, we're going to be going with the Tank Museum with some really cool footage, some real tank history, and some experts all going on there. So I'll head you over there to the very capable hands of David Willey and Richard Cutland.
Well, hello everybody, and I'm David Willey. I'm the curator here at the Tank Museum in Bovington, which is in the southwest corner of England, and I'm joined here today at the Tank Museum by my good friend.
And I'm Richard Cutland. I actually head up the military relations team for World of Tanks, but previously to that, for 30 years, I had the honour of serving with the Royal Tank Regiment in the British Army.
So what we're going to be doing for you is putting on a show that is in place of what we'd normally be doing about this time of year, which is our live TANKFEST event. Now, we did delay TANKFEST. We were hoping we were going to be able to do it later in the year. We've now had to can that completely. It's just not on for us to be able to do TANKFEST in 2020. So what we've got for you now is some of the best bits from previous TANKFEST, so we can talk about some of the vehicles, and we've got some other videos that we're putting in there, including some really great films from our European friends and North America, other museums that have similar collections to ours. And Rich is going to take you through some of those museums that will be coming on later on.
As David said, some of the museums we can look forward to. From Sweden, we have the Swedish Tank Museum, Arsenalen. We have the Museum de Blonde in France. From Belgium, we have the War Heritage Institute. We also have the Canadian War Museum, the US Army Armour and Cavalry Collection. The Dutch will also be joining us from the National Military Museum in partnership with the Historic Collection of the Royal Netherlands Army. Now there's a mouthful, David. And finally, we're also going to see a video from the superb museum that is in Vienna, the Museum of Military History.
So, as you can imagine, TANKFEST, for a museum like ours, we're an independent charity. This was one of our biggest, if not the biggest, fundraising event of the year. And we're lacking that, which means that we don't make the money we would have made. So, unashamedly, throughout our broadcast this afternoon, we're going to be trying to encourage you to, whether you go and get something on World of Tanks, like wrap your tank in that new camouflage scheme, we'll talk about that later on, that we put on our Jag Panther, or whether we can persuade you to go to our online shop, or the Tank Museum shop, and buy some of this wonderful merchandise which surrounds me at the moment, which we'll be showing you some of that a bit later on, or joining our Patreon scheme, which people can support, or just giving us a donation. That's one of our key aims for the day. We hope you think it's going to be worth it as well, because obviously without that money we can't look after the collection, we can't pay the staff, we can't put on another TANKFEST next year. So that's one of the key things we're trying to raise money and awareness, of course, throughout the afternoon. If you want to ask us questions, if you go through to either Facebook or YouTube or tankfest.org, that'll give you some of the guidance as well. You can ask us questions throughout the course of our broadcast, so we'll try and answer those, as many of those as we can. And it also takes you on a lead there to things such as our shop, if you are trying to buy, what's that interesting book you're trying to find on things. So we'll be going through all of that, and we're just about ready for our first section. So
I think we are. Just a reminder there, before we forget, a thank you already to all the World of Tanks players. As you know, the 131 bundles have actually sold out. We are going to extend it, so keep an eye on all of the World of Tanks channels, social media, and the portals, etc. And we will extend that sale at some point in the future, but keep your eye on news for that. So anyway, let's kick off this show for the next 3 hours, and we'll start off with an introduction to the Tank Museum and TANKFEST.
The Tank Museum, Bovington, UK. The home of the tank. The home of TANKFEST, and home to one of the finest collections of armour in the world. The Tank Museum tells the story of the tank and the people that served in them. There are 300 vehicles here, most of which are displayed inside the museum's large halls. In fascinating modern exhibitions, you'll come face to face with tanks that have seen action in every major conflict since the First World War. From the world's first tank to some of the latest, there is an extensive World War II collection and unique examples of the prototypes that didn't quite make the grade. With a workshop facility and an extensive archive and supporting collection, the Tank Museum is a centre of armoured excellence, sharing its passion with a global audience on its YouTube channel. Bovington is regarded as the home of the tank, because it was here that the Tank Corps, the world's first tank regiment, made its home in 1916. This remote rural location was ideal for training tank soldiers, with British, Commonwealth and US troops all passing through the gates of Bovington Camp before heading to the front lines. Over a century later, it remains a major training centre for British soldiers learning to fight in tanks. The Tank Museum was formed in 1923 as a military teaching collection. When the First World War ended in 1918, hundreds of tanks began accumulating in the fields around Bovington, waiting to be cut up for scrap. But thanks to an important intervention, rumours suggest it was Jungle Book author Rudyard Kipling, one of each type was fenced off and saved. During the interwar years, the collection continued to grow. But at the outbreak of the Second World War, some of the collection was sacrificed in the drive for scrap metal. Others were only saved because they were employed as anti-invasion defences at road junctions around the garrison. At the end of the war, the Tank Museum accepted a significant number of new donations from the army. These included many examples of Allied vehicles and a significant number of captured Axis tanks. When the Tank Museum opened to the public in the 1950s, admission was free, and visitors could climb on and inside the vehicles to their heart's content. A new era began at the Tank Museum in 2009, with the completion of a multi-million-pound redevelopment project and the opening of the flagship Tank Story exhibition. Since then, visitor numbers have continued to grow, allowing the Tank Museum to continue to develop its exhibitions and enthuse a new generation in the story of armoured warfare. And there is much more to look forward to from Bovington. But if there's one event in the museum's calendar which highlights the growing enthusiasm for our subject, then TANKFEST would be it. The first ever TANKFEST took place in 2000. With fewer than 1,000 visitors on a single afternoon, it was a small affair by modern standards and run entirely by volunteers. But the objective of the event remains the same today: to operate a range of historic armour that simply cannot be seen anywhere else. The third TANKFEST in 2004 attracted 6,000 visitors, who turned out to see Tiger 131 run in public for the first time since its capture in 1943. The event went annual in 2008 and also became a two-day show. By 2010, attendances had crossed the 10,000 mark, and in 2014, World of Tanks became the event's main sponsor. It's a partnership that has endured and seen attendances continue to grow, making TANKFEST a sellout every year. And as a result, it's the most important fundraising event in the Tank Museum calendar. The last event in 2019 welcomed 25,000 visitors across 3 action-packed days. Over the years, we've displayed some of the finest running armour in existence. From our own collection, from the military, from private collections, and from other military museums. During this live stream, we will be highlighting some of the most interesting examples from past events, and bringing you vehicles from some of the best collections in Europe and North America. Due to COVID-19, we were forced to postpone what would have been our 20th anniversary show this weekend. And now we need your support. The Tank Museum, like all museums featured in this live stream, has been forced to close its doors during the pandemic. The loss of revenue has hit us all hard, as admission fees and event tickets are the primary means by which we earn the funds required to survive. So, if you appreciate what we are presenting in this stream, please consider supporting the Tank Museum and any other of the featured museums, and help us keep these machines in order and their stories alive for generations to come. Remember, as a not-for-profit organisation, our work is funded entirely by people like you. You can support us by backing our Patreon, buying something from our online store, joining our Friends scheme, or simply by making a donation using PayPal giving. Find out more at tankfest.org. Now sit back and enjoy TANKFEST Online, the world's finest collection of tanks in action for free.
What a fantastic video, David. So David, what do you recall about TANKFEST then?
The first one, I remember it was down to right then our workshop manager, Mike Hayton, really got it organised and put it on. And the brief, and it's funny how these things come back, the full circle brief at the time back then was, it was there, please don't waste any money. You know, as long as you didn't spend any money, you can put this show on. That was basically the idea. And of course, it's developed into this tremendous, our biggest single event of the year in terms of making money for the museum. It was very basic early days, but you could see that idea of, you know, we weren't the first to drive tanks around at Bovington. The army used to do it, they used to have battle days, we used to have all sorts of different things. But that sense of how it's built, I can't imagine anyone back in 2000 thought this is what it would lead to after all that amount of time. And obviously what with you guys getting involved in everything. And it's interesting because of course you were based down here at Bovington. You've probably got your own memories of battle days and even before that. You know,
yeah, it's funny. I mean, the museum has become probably a lot more in my heart than just the museum and the area, of course. As it mentioned on the video, you know, of course, the Tank Corps being based down here as well. But when I was 16, so I joined the army at 16, and I did my basic training down here across the road in Stanley Barracks, the Junior Leaders Regiment of the Royal Armoured Corps. So I remember being petrified, dropped off at the front gate by my father, and for the next 18 months I was in there. And the museum was in existence then. Obviously it wasn't anywhere like this. I mean, it's the transformation since that period has been absolutely incredible to see. And it was, you know, the place for us to go. And it wasn't just the museum. We were absolutely, obviously, obsessed with looking at the museum. We were lucky because we got special access as well. We were allowed to come in and after hours sometimes, and the curator at the time used to allow us to have a look inside some of the vehicles. So we felt very lucky indeed compared to the general public. But it was also a place to escape. Obviously, basic training in the army is hard work, both mentally and physically. So it was somewhere we could go for an hour, escape across here, have a cup of tea, a wander around. It was a peace and quiet. You know, somewhere to really wind down for a bit. And then the whole area actually became part of my whole army career, really, because I then went from finishing my basic training there, left there as a qualified gunner on Chieftain, which we'll talk about later on. And then I went to join my regiment, which at the time was the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, which was based in Paderborn in Germany. But then I came back later in my career after promotion, etc., and I served for 2 years just down the road at the Gunnery School in Lulworth. I became a schools instructor down there. We also worked a bit with ATDU, the Trials and Development Unit up the road there as well. So the whole area has really been important to me, and even Warminster, which is not a million miles away. I did a couple of years there as a tactics instructor as well. So as I said, yeah, it means a real lot to me, this place.
So Bovington, obviously today we're going to be looking mainly at the tanks, but one of the big stories we tell here at the Tank Museum is about people and the men that serve in tanks. And we now, the good news we can tell you now as well, we are going to reopen the museum, ticket only. You're going to have to pre-book, have a look online on July the 6th. And some of you will have that opportunity if you can visit. We've just done a new World War II display, it's just about finished. We were hoping to have opened it earlier in May. And there we tell the story of the British tank crewmen in the Second World War. And as you're coming around, our display behind us here with the King Tiger behind me and the Lukes, that's part of the Normandy section of this new display that we'll be able, or some of you will be able to see when you revisit the museum, as I said, July the 6th. But do go onto our website so that you checked out all about ticket bookings, etc., because we've still got COVID-19 issues going along. So what have we been doing? We've been doing that preparation. We've been putting a lot of stuff on YouTube. So again, obviously this afternoon you'll be seeing what's going on now, but also have a look at our YouTube channel, because we've done lots of other question and answer sessions, other videos, other talks, and there's all our tank chats as well. So that's one of the things that we'll refer to as we go through. If you want to know more about some of these vehicles, go onto our website and have a look at the tank chats there. Now, Richard.
Over the years, of course, for me personally, one of the things I really loved about every single TANKFEST was the arena show, the chance to see these vehicles actually driving around. And really, the voice behind that show has always, again over the years, become synonymous with Mr. David Willey and his dulcet tones as he talks about these vehicles. So let's move straight on now. We're going to go across and look at the first of our arena shows and our tanks in action with World War I and the interwar tanks. And that's going to be followed straight away by a video from our friends in the Swedish Tank Museum.
So we're really privileged here at the Tank Museum because we've got this. This is our Mona Lisa you're looking at. This is Little Willie, what most people recognise as the first tank ever built. Many countries, we're not going to deny it, many countries have thought of the idea of something that we think of now as the tank. We're going to see later on in Vienna, there was an Austrian officer, Burstin, who comes up with a design that just looks like almost, like a modern tank. And that was before the First World War. Lancelot de Mol in Australia, lots of other people come up with the idea of some form of motorised armoured vehicle that can cross a battlefield. It's World War I that puts the pressure on, that makes this an item that's really, really needed. And what happens is after the Western Front settles down after an initial war of manoeuvre that starts in August of 1914, by Christmas the lines are static. The British, the French, what's left of the Belgian army have to force out that occupying German army. What are we going to do about it? So they start by looking at things like armoured tractors, etc. And in the end, something called the Landships Committee commissioned Fosters of Lincoln to build this vehicle. It's actually put together in 6 weeks, and it was going to have a turret on the top there. This is the second iteration of it with tracks. That Little Willie doesn't actually get active service. It's a test bed, really. This, what we're looking at now, is what the British Army ends up using. It's that classic rhomboid shaped tank. This particular one is a replica Mark IV. The Mark IV is the one Britain made the most of. The Mark I goes into action in September of 1916. This is the tank, the Mark IV, that we build about 1,000 of, and over 300 go into action at the Battle of Cambrai. This replica, by the way, you can see Buzz there driving, that's him looking out, is controlled by, everything in there is actually based on a Hyundai Digger engine, because what happened is Steven Spielberg's company, they came down to Bovington, they measured up our Mark IV tank, we've got a real one there, and they did this for the War Horse movie, built the replica, and at the end of the filming we were able to acquire the replica, so we can drive this thing around. And we'll talk a little bit later about the issues about driving real tanks around all the time and some of the problems. We've retired our 2 First World War tanks that were runners. We did that before the First World War anniversaries, very much in mind with thinking about preservation. We just needed to look after those vehicles that were getting a bit broken around the edges. And so with this wonderful replica, we can do this, which is film it, show it like this to people, and give you that impression. Look at that view there of what a tank might have been like coming forward to a German infantryman in a tank, in a trench, sort of waiting for it. Now the Germans, their initial response to the tank, they weren't too worried about it. That very first tank attack wasn't that successful. But they started a program that led to this, the A7V, 18-man crew. By the end of the war, they'd only actually built 20 of these, whopping great, look like a house on tracks there, doesn't it? It ended up with a gun, a howitzer in the front, machine guns dotted around the side, 20 of them built, not that effective. The French were looking at the idea pretty much the same time as the British, because again, French got the same problem. How are we going to push out that occupying German army? So with this tank, this is a Saint-Chamond. The first French tank is a tank called the Schneider, relatively small, but still the same problem as this one, the Saint-Chamond. They used the Holt tractor as its suspension and track system. And you can see they try to extend it, but it's not that long. And so both this tank, the Saint-Chamond, and its predecessor, the Schneider, have big overhangs either end. And you can imagine on a pretty rough battlefield, that's not going to do you any good. 8-man crew, 75mm, the classic French artillery piece stuck in the front there. And they do see action, but they are not that successful. They are getting bogged down, getting trapped in mud. Any sort of bank, this thing tends to get stuck. The amazing thing about it, though, is inside there is petrol-electric drive. Right back in the First World War, you've got petrol-electric, so an engine that's actually powering little electric motors. Now this is it's technically not a First World War vehicle, this is our 1920 pattern Rolls-Royce, but it looks pretty much as they did in the First World War. The Rolls-Royce, obviously that amazing, the Silver Ghost, amazing car, very reliable, beautifully built. armour plate on the top of it, and it tends to go on forever. And this particular one was built in Derby in 1920. It saw action around the world. It was in Shanghai in the late 1920s. This was still patrolling the coastline of Norfolk in the beginning of the Second World War. And under there, you can just about see glinting there, that radiator. That's your classic Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost radiator, red letters, not black. They changed them black after Rolls died. But there you've got a vehicle that was that one end of a spectrum. Why not buy the best vehicle going, put armour plate on it, and it keeps going forever? And it's a pleasure. This is another one of these vehicles. Anyone who drives it will tell you what a wonderful vehicle it is to drive. And all the old jokes about, you know, is it running, sir, and everything, because the engine is so quiet, so silent. They double up the wheels at the back. That's about the only real difference there, and strengthen the springs for just over a 3-ton armoured vehicle. So you're looking there at a vehicle that, a bit of a rarity, and another rarity here. This was where we had the opportunity of driving our Vickers medium tank. After the First World War, Britain does retain tanks. It has about 5 battalions of those rhomboid Mark Vs. It's just started to get the medium D in. But Vickers becomes the only real tank design workshop in the UK. And they answer a call from the military in about 1923. They want a vehicle, and here we've got one that becomes a vehicle that Britain really trains with. A couple of hundred are made. It really trains with them and experiments with them in the 20s and 30s. And at the time, this is a complete world beater. 3-pounder gun, so a high velocity gun, so that could take on other tanks if it ever met them. And really importantly, a 3-man turret. And the next tank that comes along that goes into production with a 3-man turret is the Panzer III. Why is it so important? Is because it means a commander can command. You've got a gunner who's actually laying or aiming the gun, and on the other side you've got a loader. Down the front you've actually got a driver in his own little sort of box. You can see him there with his head out at the front, engine next to him, and you can actually duplicate. You can have other guys firing machine guns, 3 Vickers machine guns set around the side. So a tank that whenever it appears, it always looks, you know, rather dated and everything, but when it comes into service, cutting edge. And the Tank Corps are using this vehicle up on Salisbury Plain at the end of the 1920s with other armoured vehicles like little scout vehicles, troops in trucks, etc. Something called the mechanised force, experimenting with the idea, what can we do with a mechanised force against traditional forces, so cavalry on horseback, marching infantry. And the British High Command, they fall for the idea, they think it's a great idea. What happens is a 1930 depression, no one, especially Britain, has any money to be able to do much with that into the 1930s. We also have something called the 10-year rule. We're not going to go to war for 10 years, so it's only really from about 1934 that rearmament in Britain begins, and the money tends to go for aeroplanes, for defence, and the Navy. Tanks are low down the list, but we start building tanks again from about early in the 1930s. But this is a real rarity to see this driving around, classic British vehicle of that period, and something that again, really, you know, I doubt very much it will get out again because it's now back inside the museum. So as a runner, this was one of those moments where of seeing, there's only another one of these left in South Africa, I believe, and a bit of a rusty one over in Fort Benning in America. So quite something to see there. They also are very adaptable. They took the turrets off and made one a command post. They did another sort of version for towing artillery as well. So another one of these vehicles that early days in production runs where people are realising a costly vehicle, let's try and multitask it, let's get all we possibly can from it. Now here we've got another strand of vehicles that was being built in the 20s and 30s. Vickers also invested in light tanks, and the Army were buying these. This is a Mark IV, probably our earliest running track vehicle at the moment. This was really kindly sat in the sheds looking a bit forlorn for itself. A chap came along and offered us some money for restoring it, so we restored this one. 2-man crews, last of the light tanks, but Vickers ended up, they came up with a light 6B. These were the tanks that Britain was starting to build before the Second World War to also give factories some form of knowledge base, of experience in building tanks before World War II came along. So there's some of the British tanks we're going around. We're now going to go to Sweden and look at one of their vehicles.
Welcome to Sweden and the Swedish Tank Museum, Arsenalen. We are located 1 hour Drive west of Stockholm, and we are open all year. In the museum you can have a look at the development of tanks and military vehicles from First World War till present day. And we don't only have Swedish vehicles, we also have a lot of foreign vehicles to show the impact on history and why we developed a tank industry in Sweden. We have a few very unique vehicles that's only possible to see here in Sweden, the only examples in the world. So it's an interesting collection from many aspects. You can follow us on social media, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and of course our homepage. Today we are going to show you a tank that's only possible to see live here in Sweden. 100 years old German tank from the First World War. The German LK2, made in 1918 and used in Sweden from 1922 to 1930. And we will present it to you in a few seconds.
So what we're looking at now is quite an amazing vehicle. This is a vehicle that the Swedes call an LK2, but what it really is a German tank of the First World War. Now we saw earlier that mock-up A7V, which was, A7V is the actual sort of abbreviation of the design bureau or the office in the German military that was looking after motorization. And this is a vehicle that Hans Vollmer, who designs the A7V, comes up with. It looks a bit like the British Whippet tank. So you've got the engine in the front, this barbette as it were at the back. You can see there the driver looking out of it, and a little turret with a machine gun on. What happens is two prototypes are made by July of 1918, but they don't see action, they don't go into production. But Sweden secretly, after the First World War, it negotiates with the Germans and they buy in essence what becomes about the kit for 20 of these LK2 tanks. And they're taken over to Sweden. 5 of them are later upgraded, and that's what we're looking up here is one of the upgraded ones. They put a new Scania engine in. The original Benz engine wasn't really powerful enough. And amazingly, quite a number of these ended up surviving. Of the 10, one was gifted back to the German, the Panzer Museum in Münster. There's one of the 5 earlier models is on display inside the museum, and this is one of the models that they got going again with a tremendous restoration project. Started back, I think it was about 2018. They got help from industry, volunteers, all sorts of people there. And when you think what they're trying to do there, putting together a vehicle of that age that dates back from the 1920s is really, really quite something. So you're looking at a piece of German First World War tank design as adapted and used by the Swedes. And these tanks, Sweden ends up becoming a tank producing nation. That's the other thing, which is quite interesting, seeing which countries take up tanks, sometimes buying in tanks from abroad, as Sweden did here then, but then they build their own factories and their own defensive industries. And Sweden is one of the few countries left in the world at the moment that still basically, with Hägglunds, can still put together a fairly sizable armoured vehicle. So this LK2, I think, Richard, you've actually been out there and you've seen this one driving around, haven't you?
Fantastic restoration, and I have to say Stefan has done, his team there, considering all volunteers as well, have done an incredible job on there. Something like 5,000 man hours to get this ready in a 4.5-year restoration process. So a truly incredible vehicle and well worth doing.
So if you've not been, I mean, I've been out there as well. This is their museum there is quite a stunning museum because the range of vehicles they've actually got in place is quite something, as Stefan was showing us, sort of thing. And they do, again, an event similar to our TANKFEST. And I know you guys have also put in place there another one of your games areas, haven't you?
Yes, we have. Yeah, we've got a gaming area there as well. And I can't believe Stefan didn't showcase an S-Tank.
Yeah, that would be one of those ones. We have an S-Tank here, but I think it costs the amount of money to keep one of those going, isn't it? What was their engines?
So that was a few glimpses from the Swedish Museum, Arsenalen. And if you want to come and visit us, please do. And in the meantime, you can follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and of course, the homepage. Hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.
So we were saying earlier, weren't we, it looked like Stefan needs a good little tickle around the ribs sometimes, but he's actually a lovely guy, very friendly. If you do go over there, and that he does smile and break into smile. And another one that if you look on their website, they do some cracking films as well. So Stefan's done a lovely little video on how you eat your food in a tank and some of the history behind that.
And a beautiful, real friendly, family orientated museum as well.
Really
so
worth a
really
visit
nice.
if you have your chance to go to Sweden.
So David, we've got a couple of questions for you actually.
Right.
Before we forget, so we've got first one from YouTube and Matmo. Is it true that a World War I tank was used at Arishmel Gap, just down the road, as anti-tank invasion gunnery?
I don't know about the First World War I. We do know our First World War collection was dragged out around Bovington, so there are pictures of them. The dead tanks were actually put at certain road junctions as basically static pillboxes as potential. Down at Arishmel there's a photograph of a Vickers medium. We saw that just driving around on one of our displays. There's a photograph of one of those actually activated down there in the between almost the tank traps. There it is in the centre position there. There was a First World War tank on loan. Well, actually it wasn't on loan, it was what they called a memorial tank. It was in Portsmouth Dockyard at the place Whale Island, the gunnery school. They actually got that working in World War II, and it patrolled, it drove around the dockyard as, again, anti-invasion measure. Apparently, well, luckily for the tank and probably Britain as a whole, we weren't invaded. So the only actual action it got, apparently one evening, it got slightly lost and it drove over a doctor's car that parked his car in the wrong place. So that was the end of the doctor's car. But I know that there's lots of different stories about, because again, in the summer of 1940, the desperation, we've got some of the vehicles here, of trying to put an armoured vehicle together quickly because, quite frankly, anything was going to be better than nothing. So half the collection here goes out and starts ending up trying to defend Bovington.
Just perhaps clear for everybody, it's down at Lulworth, Arishmel Gap down there, so it's where the ranges are. So we actually, we take the tanks down there and we fire out to sea, which is always quite amusing. You're always worried that in case you get the wrong scale on your graphical pattern in a tank, it might, fire a Hesh round off to the coast of Calais or something. Another question for you here, from Facebook this time, David, from Milin Junkovic. I do apologise if that's not right. What caused the damage to the front of Little Willie? Good question.
As I mentioned, so Little Willie doesn't see any action. It's used as a, first of all, that sort of kind of like test bed. Second type of track is the type that they use on all the British. Back there in another spot on up at Arishmel Gap, not Arishmel Gap, sorry, it's one of the training areas just outside London. There's still photographs of it there, but I think what's happened is at some point when it's been either here or down at Bovington, it used to be outside like most of the original part of the collection, someone's put something like a metal hawser through that front piece and dragged it to get it to the position they want, and that has quietly peeled off what was just mild steel. It's not armour plate on the vehicle, so it's just peeled it back. So that's that damage. And like a lot of vehicles here, their history is quite checkered. This idea, we try and keep them in the dry, we look after them as best we can now. In the past, these have been sat outside. Oiks like yourself were playing on them, obviously, when they're out the back here. So it was, well, I remember the first my visit here, I got told off. I remember climbing in the belly plate and under the hatch to a Sherman, getting covered in oil. So all those things have changed, obviously, over time. But that's the damage there. Certainly isn't battle damage.
And I think it's time for we move on to our next piece. And now the next segment we've got is probably one of our longest videos.
It is, so it might give us a chance to have a slurp of water or something. But
there's something about TOG II.
There's something about TOG II. It's the biggest, heaviest vehicle in our entire collection. Nowadays it's one of our most popular exhibits, and it was, of course, a complete and total failure. As the only survivor of a failed programme, it played no part in the war that saw its creation. In fact, it's amazing that it survived at all. For many years, it sat here in a quiet corner of the museum alongside other failures such as Excelsior and Valiant. And there it sat, ignored by everybody, until something amazing happened.
And yet it just has such charm and
Bit
character.
of a cult following since.
And it's not really
TOG
that
wins.
wonderful a machine.
It
but
is dearly loved by so many people.
TOG is love and TOG is life.
Everybody wants to be friends with it. TOGs are the party tank. Everybody loves the
You
TOG.
do not get this in any other
So
tank.
what is it about the TOG?
TOG is quite happy if victims come to TOG.
Hi there. So I've been asked to explain the origins of my love for the TOG II tank. And it's quite a simple answer. I wasn't even aware that the tank existed until it was introduced into the game World of Tanks. And the first time I ever saw TOG II was in the game World of Tanks. And I can remember it clearly because I and everybody else on my team, when we saw this thing, we completely forgot about even attempting to fight the enemy, and instead everybody just drove their tanks in circles around the TOG. Just kind of marvelling at its sheer, majestic, unbridled, eccentric British majesty. We couldn't believe that such a thing had ever actually existed, and of course it did, and in fact still does, because they have one, the only one, at the Tank Museum in Bovington. And just the sheer impracticality of the machine endeared it to me. I mean, it was a machine that was designed to win the First World War just in time for the Second World War. It's possibly one of the worst tanks ever made, and yet it just has such charm and character that it is dearly loved by so many people. And that is how I first learned of the TOG II and why I love it as much as I do.
I was going to tell you a joke about the TOG, but it was too long.
it was designed for a war that never was going to happen, because they thought that there'd be a new Western Front between the Maginot Line and the Siegfried Line, which is where this tank was going to play about. But in fact, it had been designed for a war that had been over for 20 years by the time they got round to building it. So it was a complete waste of time, waste of resources and everything. Far too big and far too clumsy to use as a fighting tank.
Unfortunately, TOG not very fast.
So TOG was designed by the same design team who had been central in First World War tank design. It was built by the same company who made Little Willie, the world's first ever tank. Work began in earnest by the old gang in September 1939, but with the advent of Blitzkrieg and fast-moving Panzer divisions, it became clear that the Second World War would not witness the kind of stalemate that we saw in the First. Now, over an extended period, various design changes were made to the TOG to keep trying to bring it up to date. But with the continuous evolving of warfare, coupled with successful designs like Cromwell, Sherman, and other sort of modern tanks, TOG proved to be continuously obsolete, and eventually the project was abandoned in 1944. TOG came to the museum in the 1950s from a British Defence Research Unit, and it sat outside before being brought indoors in the late 1980s. Now, its tremendous size, weight and scale means that moving this vehicle is no easy feat, and to put it in its current location required the combined services of a Chieftain armoured recovery vehicle with a huge amount of washing up liquid, and that's how it got to where it is today. But that wasn't the end of the story.
TOG does not have time for artillery.
The TOG has been in World of Tanks longer than some people have been playing. Relatively unknown to many tank enthusiasts and gamers, once it was put in World of Tanks it became a huge hit, and it's developed a bit of a cult following since. It's a very unique playstyle in that it has a huge amount of hit points, a very large profile and high rate of fire gun. It doesn't really use finesse to get victory, but more just bully your opponents through sheer brawling power. Enemies love it because it's easy to hit, and your allies love it because they get to hide behind you from enemies shooting at them, and yeah, it's a very simple tank in just the game. Speaking of the cult following, it's become much like Marmite has. Either you'll love it or you'll hate it for its type of playstyle, and it's just, yeah, TOG is love and TOG is life.
As I say, they did say it was difficult to steer, and I don't believe that for a minute. There's so much of this tank behind the turret, going back for miles, it seems.
My name's Andrew Hills, and I've been asked by the Tank Museum at Bovington to give a short defence of TOG II. Why have they asked me? Well, I'm the guy who wrote the book on the work of the Special Vehicle Development Committee. That's the official name for the old gang. Why did I choose to dedicate several years of work to that? Well, because it's a mechanically fascinating vehicle. For example, the driver could move around at speeds of up to 12 miles an hour off-road. That's speeds equivalent to a vehicle like the Panzer IV, a medium tank. Add to that the fact that it can blast through defences and obstacles like barbed wire, otherwise impenetrable to contemporary British tanks. And that's an impressive vehicle, especially when you consider it weighs over 70 tonnes. Why is it so big? Well, that's easy. It was designed by criteria set by the military at the end of 1939 for a vehicle which had to be able to cross a 16-foot wide trench without bridging equipment. And you just can't do that unless your tank is very long. It's that high because the only engine powerful and available enough was a large marine diesel engine, and it's that shape to make manufacture easier. Add to this the fact that it had to be immune to enemy anti-tank guns and carry a gun capable of smashing German concrete bunkers, and you have a virtually impossible set of criteria, yet these men achieved it. The TOG II in fact marks a significant milestone for British tank technology. Torsion bar suspension, hybrid drive, modular construction, a giant gun, whether it's the 28 or 17 pounder. For sure, it's not a handsome tank, but it is a magnificent piece of work, showing the brilliant engineering efforts of men like Sir Albert Stearns, Harry Ricardo, Sir Walter Wilson, Sir William Tritton and others. The fact that these men were old is irrelevant. The fact that they built the near impossible is not, and that's why TOG II is important. For sure, it's not without problems, but what these men achieved was incredible, creating a vehicle superior to the Churchill, and dare I say, even the famous German Tiger.
Much like Marmite has, either you'll love it or you'll hate it.
Whichever the side of the debate you fall on, an experiment like TOG really exemplifies the value of a museum like this one, because without the existence of the Tank Museum, there would have been no reason to preserve this vehicle, and it would simply have gone to scrap. It didn't fight in the 20th century's most significant conflicts. It never saw service or action. And according to David Fletcher, the only reason it was preserved was its sheer idiosyncrasy and quirkiness. There was simply nothing else like it in existence, and that made it worth holding on to for the Tank Museum. And its survival and its preservation meant it had the opportunity to become famous through World of Tanks. And legions of fans have come to visit the tank here in Bovington, have begun to debate the nature of armoured warfare. And because of that interest, because of that engagement, we will continue to preserve this bizarre tank for generations to come.
So we're back again.
Back again, and I think it would be you've been in a lot of trouble, David. You didn't just mention some of the TOG merchandise.
So if you go on our shop, follow to the top, there is a plethora of t-shirts, witty and not so witty ones, all to do with TOG. You can buy your fridge magnet, you can buy you name it. If you're a TOG fan, that's the place to go to. And it's also one of those tanks, I know we talked about a little earlier on, where the game has brought interest in that tank again, you know, back to this idea of when I first came here, TOG was always going to be a big and impressive tank. And it's actually in our Tamir Hall, you saw the photograph of it there being moved. That used to be the front of the museum, and quite frankly, when Mr. Tamir, the model maker, sponsored having that hall built many moons ago, the tank was inside, you know, it was just literally left there and the roof built over the top of it, that big. But another tank that is, again, has enormous amounts of interest now because of the game is Tortoise. And that's another tank we'll see a little bit later on, where those vehicles that, because of the level of interest across some of the more obscure, the wacky, the bigger, the first, all these ones, and those paper tanks as well that weren't getting built, that's where it's brought an interest that just wasn't there. Certainly in my time, I didn't see before.
And we've got a couple of questions actually for you, David. One from Christian on YouTube. Is the gun on TOG II a 17-pounder?
It is on currently, but TOG's another one of those vehicles that go through a number of iterations. It starts off with, you can see those pictures, Matilda turret, all sorts of things, £2. But yes, at the moment, TOG has got a 17-pounder on with that big slab-sided turret that was being designed really that goes on the Challenger tank, A30 tank later. So, yeah.
And another question, Casper from Facebook, again, TOG II, and I love this question. I hope it's going to be a good answer for this, David. Can we restore to running condition?
Yeah, we'll have it ready for you for tomorrow. No problems at all. We'll have it running around outside. It is a major undertaking, and maybe at some point later on we'll talk about, again, do go to, I was just looking at various things we're trying to promote here. We do a question and answer session for our patrons, and there's a number of these issues come up time and time again, and you can imagine the topic about, what's worth returning to running order, what are the costs, the issues involved. We're going to see a tank in a moment that we recorded for the public, how that restoration went, all those are things. Gut feeling, quick answer, no, you're not going to see TOG running around because we're going to need a much bigger arena. We're going to need an awful lot of money for doing things like that, which is why, just to give you a little bit of optimistic hope, if you keep buying things from our shop or joining our patron scheme, we'll be able to restore all those other ones that are already on the list that we've got to get done.
So come on, David, if there was discussion about renovating the mouse, surely you can renovate a TOG II,
oh yes, yeah. We won't talk about that one, will we? But that's not a vehicle at our museum, of course, there. So looking at that, but do please go and have a look if you are interested. If you're big TOG guys, we have got some great TOG merchandise out there, so you'll be doing your duty by buying one of those T-shirts.
And we did have the when we were talking about Sweden and the volunteers and that sort of thing as well. I think it's important to raise. You are a charity organisation down here, but you've got an awful lot of volunteers that work with you as well.
Yeah, not just us. You'll see in a lot of those museums that we'll be showcasing with their videos. We have a core of staff, hopefully paid, knowing what they're doing and everything, but actually it's that massive group of volunteers in lots of different areas. So we've got archive and library, we've got people who help guide the people here, so guides, we've got workshop staff, we've got people that come in for special events, we've got people driving the vehicles, helping maintain them. Most museums, in fact an awful lot of the heritage sector, couldn't exist without the volunteers. So yet again, thank you. I was popped in here yesterday, it's a Saturday afternoon, we have some volunteers in, they're cleaning these tanks ready for our July the 6th opening. So it's things like that that make us be able to do what we can do, and certainly TANKFEST could not take part, or we couldn't do it full stop without those volunteers coming along and assisting us. So vital to the museum sector.
So back to the show, and again we're back to you, David, in the arena. This time we're going to have a look at a selection of early World War II vehicles, followed by our second guest museum, Muséum de Blondet, the French Tank Museum.
Now, we've been really lucky at the Tank Museum because many thanks to World of Tanks, you're the guys, and there you are on the posters behind there on our Vehicle Conservation Centre. You've been able to fund getting vehicles that, quite frankly, it's a lot of money moving tanks around the place, and this is one of the vehicles that came across from the French Tank Museum that's based in Souma. This is their running Char B tank. And this is one of those vehicles that when you look at it, go back to those images we saw of our First World War tanks, you can see that design process started just after the First World War, and it's with that First World War attack in mind. It's got a howitzer in the hull, a 75mm gun there, and a 47mm an anti-tank gun up in that one-man turret. And that one-man turret we'll see again because it appears on a number of French tanks in the 20s and 30s. The design process, the competitions, the various things that went into making the Char B meant that they weren't really ready till much later on, 33 to 37. They start building the first series of these tanks. 369 of them are ready by the beginning of the Second World War. Really think of them as whopping great big breakthrough tanks. This tank coming on, this is our Matilda I, and in Britain, so we looked at that medium D. In about 1933, Hugh Ellis, who's in charge of his Master of Ordnance, he says Britain's going to need two main types of tanks. Matilda I that you're seeing here is what they're going to call an infantry tank, and it's going to support the infantry on the attack. So thick armour, because it's bound to be slow, it's going to take some punishment, machine gun because it needs to suppress the enemy soldiers, and your infantry are going to march on behind it. That was the idea behind the Matilda I. There were some of them were issued with what they call a 50 caliber Browning Vickers machine gun. It's got more punch. Yes, it might have gone through some of the early tanks it might have met, but really this is a tank that's there for going across the battlefield. 15,000 guineas to develop. Each tank costs about 5,000 guineas, and it's when we start rearming from 1934 onwards, these are those first model of infantry tank they put into service. Even as it enters service, they're designing this one, the replacement. This is the second type of infantry tank the British decide to go for, and we call it the Matilda II, and it's an absolute battle winner early in the war. It's heavily armoured, very thick armour on the front. It's got the British 2-pounder gun, which is about a 40mm gun. Everyone gets confused, why 2-pounder? Weight of solid shot it fires is 2 pounds in the old weighing system. If you measure the hole at the end of the barrel, that's 40mm across, so if in modern parlance you tend to call it a 40mm gun. Thick armour, as I mentioned, and there in that turret you get, they do try and squeeze 3 guys in there. They do a version of it with a howitzer in as well for what they call close support, fire smoke rounds or high explosive rounds. And this tank out in France proved a real shock to the Germans because basically the armour was so thick it was impervious to the standard German 37mm anti-tank gun. And it's Hitler reading reports of that anti-tank gun, the rounds bouncing off. We just saw the Shah B and the Matilda II. That's what leads him to initiate the famous Tiger tank project to get that going. Now I mentioned this tank because this tank has gone through a full restoration. If you go onto our YouTube channel or go on the website, you can follow the links there, Matilda Diaries, and it takes you through the whole restoration of a vehicle. To be honest, when we started this one, we thought it just got a few mechanical problems, and it's how we then have to take it all apart, put it back together, what ends up happening with it, and we put it aside. You can see there it says the Princess Royal because Princess Anne came down and opened our new workshops, and there she was sitting there in front. Now this tank coming on, this is a Valentine. This is actually the third type of infantry tank that Britain produced, but we ended up using it in a slightly different way. Yes, it's still got thick armour, it has a 2-pounder gun on, but we ended up using it for the other type of role tanks Hugh Ellis envisaged, which is a cruiser tank. So going a bit faster and actually being used for the breakthrough that the infantry tanks, to break out into territory behind the front line. And the Valentine is actually a tank, I think it's 6,000 to 8,000 are made, 2,000 over in Canada, that mainly the Canadian made ones go off to Russia as part of Lend-Lease, supporting the Russians. And it's actually a very popular tank, it's reliable. Vickers designed it. It's got good reliability, which again is a tremendously important thing in a tank, and it sees a lot of service, and it's used in a lot of variants. And here we've got John Pearson's privately owned Valentine DD tank. The first tank they try and float is actually a Tetrarch. Nicholas Strausler puts that canvas screen around the vehicle, put it in water, displaces enough to make it float. DD duplex drive, 2 ways of driving it, one by the propeller on the back, the other by the tracks when it's on land. And you raise that screen, what looked like a sausage of canvas around it at the moment, comes up, held up by inflated tubes and struts, and it floats ashore. D-Day, of course, they actually use Sherman ones, but we train on DD Valentines. And this is another classic we don't run anymore. This is in our currently in our new display hall, I think it is. We're putting that in our new World War II display. It's a Crusader. Crusader was basically the Cruiser 3 tank, and this version we've got the 6-pounder gun on. The Crusader tends to get a bit of a bad reputation. It had a Liberty engine in the back. The first models with the 2-pounder gun on had great reliability problems, overheating, problems with the coolant. This, by the time of Crusader 3, they've actually ironed a lot of those out. And this is a tank that can go fast because it's got Christie suspension. Those big wheels on the side, indication of Christie suspension. They have springs on that have a lot of play in, so they can go up and down. So that means you can move at speed. Liberty engine gave it a lot of power. And by the time, as we see here, the 6-pounder gun on, that's a lot of punch on the tank that will go through. That will take on, at the time when it was out in the desert, your Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. So the Crusader, it sees service in North Africa, across the desert campaign, finishes up in Tunisia, but then it doesn't go to Italy. But the body is used. Now they've got it more reliable. They use it for the basis of certain anti-aircraft carrying things with turrets with Oerlikons on. They were used for the D-Day landing. So once they got it right, it was actually a rather good vehicle. Now looking at our famous, this is our Panzer III that's been a runner a long time. This is the sort of tank that Crusader would have been going up against. This is an L model on the Panzer III. So basically Ausführung, you know, or mark or delineation, A, B, C, you work your way through. This is up to the L model. So the Germans are constantly working on their tanks, coming up with an improved version or sometimes a simplified version of that tank. The L has extra armour bolted onto the front. You can see there, there's a machine gun, a ball mount for the machine gun on the left-hand side as you look at it, and the driver's visor on the right-hand side. This has now got the long-barreled 50mm gun on. The Panzer III originally starts its life with just that 37mm standard anti-tank gun. Short-barreled 50mm, then a long-barreled, and they end up actually swapping roles with a Panzer IV. We'll see a Panzer IV in a little while, but not driving around the arena. Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs were the tanks that Germany built really to go to war with. And the irony is, even though they're supposed to do different roles, this really is the cruiser tank equivalent with the British. This is the one that goes through the gaps in the front line. Panzer IV was supposed to be the one that has the close support weapon on it that fires high explosive. Both tanks ended up looking pretty much the same, which is a bit of an irony there. Now this is our Stuart, American Stuart M3 tank. Nice early one. This is actually privately loaned, but on loan to the Tank Museum. You can tell it's an early one by those where the driver's looking out at the front. High rear because it's got that radial aircraft engine in the back, and the transmission goes right the way through to the front. You can see that drive sprocket, the toothed wheel on the front there. And this version is the M3 version. We'll see in a moment the M5 version. They didn't call an M4 version. You should have done the next one because they thought it would get confused with the M4 Sherman. So this one we're able to drive around. Again, that American design from the late 1930s. They're building very few tanks. When the war comes, that's when they've got things like suspension systems, engines ready, various components lined up that they can start putting together and produce very, very quickly things like the M3 tank, then the M3 Stuart as we're looking at here, then the M5 Stuart a little bit later on, an improvement, and of course the very famous M3 Grant tank, which is a bit of an interim model before the M4 Sherman. Now there's our later, you can tell the difference, smooth front, that makes an M5 version of the Stuart, and this one's got deep wading apparatus on it. Now we're going to have another look at another one of the museums, now off to France.
Welcome to France. Nous sommes à Saumur, sur les bords de la Loire, au musée des blindés, musée général Estienne, du nom du père créateur des blindés dans l'armée française pendant la Première Guerre mondiale. Le musée des blindés, c'est 10 000 m² de surface d'exposition permanente, plus de 200 véhicules provenant de 17 nations. Le musée est ouvert toute l'année et il a accueilli en 2019 70 000 visiteurs. Le musée des blindés présente dans 10 principales salles 100 ans d'histoire à partir de 1917. Je vais vous présenter quelques-unes des principales pièces exposées dans ce musée. Alors, nous nous trouvons devant le blindé Schneider, premier véhicule blindé opérationnel de l'armée française pendant la Première Guerre mondiale en 1917. Le musée des blindés possède une des plus grandes collections de blindés allemands de la Seconde Guerre mondiale au monde, et juste derrière moi, le Tigre II, qui est le seul actuellement en état de rouler. Le Crusader anti-aérien qui a été utilisé par les Britanniques lors de la bataille de Normandie en juin-juillet 1944. Je suis sur le char ARL-44, qui est le premier char qui a été construit par l'industrie de l'armement française après la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Il pèse 50 tonnes et il est propulsé par un moteur de Panzer. Le char derrière moi est un Souma, considéré comme le meilleur char de tous les belligérants de la campagne de France de 1940. Il a été restauré cette année pour les commémorations du 80e anniversaire de la campagne de France.
So Colonel Pierre there, we've had the pleasure to meet, and we meet regularly. We have an annual TankNet meeting, which means that all the main military museums with tanks, we get together once a year, and we've had the pleasure of going to Souma as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. This is their Souma tank. This is one of those tanks, again, we tend to have, or we're trying to, constantly knock that myth that in 1940, when the German Panzer forces attacked France, somehow they've got better tanks, the Germans, etc. Not the case at all. In terms of numbers and quality, probably the Allies certainly had more tanks, and in terms of quality, the Allied tanks in many areas were better. And the Souma is a tank designed for the French cavalry. The French realise they're going to need those heavy tanks like the Char B1, that is, we've seen already. This is a lighter tank for the cavalry divisions, the new cavalry divisions that are going to be the mobile force. The French have realised the Maginot Line is their main defence against Germany, but there's a gap at the northern end. So they have ready some mobile divisions that will either go to defend that French border or go into Belgium with the British to defend in there. And the Souma has got cast armour, and you can see them putting into place there. That cast armour rear is 3 pieces of cast armour, a cast turret. One of the problems of the tank though, even though it's got a great gun in, the SA-35 gun, it's a 47mm gun that would go through about, 33mm armours at about 500 metres, so pretty much anything the Germans put out in 1940, this gun could defeat. The problem about it, they didn't have enough radios ready to put in every single tank. So tend to be the squadron leader would have a radio, but other tanks in that squadron wouldn't have them. But the armour protection is brilliant. And what we're looking at here is, this is the tank that they've got running. It's a beautiful looking example. There was one of these extravagant French camouflage schemes that were being put on vehicles in the late 1930s. And all told, the Souma, when it did meet German tanks in the Second World War, quite often battles like Stone, where the French tanks come out on top. The Germans were actually told, go round the outside, do not stop and try and take on the French tanks. Mobility and command structure was the way the Germans were beating the French, and obviously the collapse of the French command structure didn't go down too well as well. But that Souma, a wonderful tank there, and the engineers who designed and did the castings go over to America and help the Americans actually put together the Grant tank.
Vous pouvez nous retrouver sur les différents réseaux sociaux, Facebook, Instagram et sur le site du musée des blindés. Vous y retrouverez l'actualité du musée. Nous vous y attendrons. À très bientôt.
Now, Richard, you've been out to Souma, haven't they, and no doubt taken part in the French hospitality there.
Fantastic. I mean, one of my obviously after Bovington, of course, one of my favourite museums. Absolutely love the collection. The collection is vast, and I think people just don't understand how vast it is, to be honest. And very much like you've got your vehicle conservation centre, they have hangars at the side with what we always consider the best stuff is kept in over there. And their running fleets, I have to say, considering the amount of staff they've got down there, is absolutely extraordinary. What they can actually run is quite mind-boggling.
Yeah, the French, you can say, we said earlier, you have to be careful how you say that, they had the advantage. There was lots of vehicles in France at the end of the Second World War, so French tanks were in service, American tanks were in service with the French army much later than some other countries, so there's a lot of Sherman variants. And of course the French military as well, so they actually took Panther tanks and put them into service, carried on making Maybach engines. So there's a number of issues there, because we all drool when we see some of their reserves and some of their collections there. But if you have the opportunity to go to Souma on the Loire Valley, it's a beautiful part of the world and a stunning collection that they've got there. And I know, we've both benefited. I know, and in fact, I think you were funding it when we had our TankNet meeting out there, and World of Tanks were funding. We had a lovely evening out with the French, I can tell you that much.
And interesting that you mentioned the Panther as well. Of course, you said about transporting vehicles. When we spotted, I think it was last year actually, TankFest 2019, their very famous Britannia Panther, which was the Panther captured by the French, used against the German, joined the Besnier squadron after that famous French captain. But obviously, I never appreciated it. It's probably one of the first times I've been involved in this transportation of vehicles across countries and things. And yeah, a lot of paperwork, I have to say. We didn't appreciate that.
So that's another one of the things when those of you, when you're saying, oh, why haven't you done this? Why can't you get that and everything? Cost, just remember that. All of these things cost a vast amount of time. There are things, you can imagine, moving tanks are weapons of war. And not every country likes seeing armour and trying to explain to people at customs posts and borders, etc., that you've got all the paperwork, whatever. Whoa, whoa, whoa. It's like trying to explain to anyone if you've got a gun in the boot of the car. You might know it's deactivated, but that young policeman who stopped you is not going to be too happy about it. So those are some of those issues sometimes where there is an awful lot that goes into this. I come back to thank you to World of Tanks, because they've been that body that's been able to sponsor us to get vehicles here that just quite frankly we wouldn't be able to afford normally.
David, I think we've got time for a quick question for you from Gareth on Facebook. Which of Hobart's funnies is David's favourite?
Okay. I'd probably say Churchill Avery. I just think the ingenuity that goes into, there's one vehicle there, actually amazing, Canadian, Dennison, who ends up, he's at the Dieppe landings, he comes back, looks at the Churchill, and he's the one that pushes forward the idea of the Avery. And of course Hobart, this maverick character who looks after the 79th Armoured Division, is brilliant for that role. He doesn't suffer fools gladly, he gets things done. He is a brilliant trainer of men, and look at that Avery as well. As a Churchill Avery, fires a petard mortar, basically anything in the way. If you're around where a petard mortar lands, boy, it just gets shredded and blasted. It can carry a box girder bridge, so it can lay a bridge. It can carry a fascine. It's got room inside for demolition charges for the Royal Engineer crews to use. So lots of things can be done with an Avery, and that type of specialised armour used by the 79th Armoured Division, it's used, it was really intended for D-Day, but they realised, hang on, we might as well carry on using this. And by the end of the Second World War, the 79th Armoured Division is the largest armoured unit in Europe. It never fights together. It's always parcelled out for where it's going to be needed, supporting, whether it's Americans, whether it's British troops. And it is one of those bits of British tank design that is a remarkable success. So that's another one of these things about, the innovation, the things that go into it. Other countries, of course, had their own engineer type variants, but never to the scale and to the breadth, I think, of the 79th Armoured Division. So I'd go for a Churchill Avery, because it's another one of those vehicles that if you talk to modern fighting soldiers, actually, why haven't we got a demolition gun? Why haven't we got, what I mean? Because, of course, in modern urban warfare, you are going to need engineer variants all the time. Put a dozer blade on the front of things all the time. Well, anyway, here we go. Right, that's answered that one. Right.
And I think we're going to go to the first of our death matches actually shortly. The death matches for this, what we want to try to achieve is we're going to give a look. It's using gameplay as well. So we'll talk a little bit about the game, but not too much. David is going to talk a bit about the historical side of it. And the question I get asked all the time about World of Tanks, of course, is how realistic is it? How does the game compare to doing the real deal? So what we'll try and do in this, we'll have a conversation between the two of us, and we'll try to tie up some of those loose ends and some of those questions. So our first death match. So straight away, David, you can see there gives you an indication of some of the maps and things you can get. There are 40 plus maps in World of Tanks. We're obviously not going to go through them all. But the level of the map and what the map is, so you've got things all the way from sort of fighting in built-up areas, operations in built-up areas, that sort of thing, to open plain, to snowy cap mountains, so a wide variety of maps. And the maps, to a certain degree, will actually affect how your gameplay goes from the rest of the game. But we'll talk about that a bit later on.
Yeah, I have to say, not being a games player, one of the first things that when we looked at these for the first time, just staggering, the realism of the landscape, etc. And there's our Souma again, the tank we were just talking about earlier on, F-35. Souma, by the way, it's a lovely plaque on the front and the back of it. You can see that they bolt on. We'll come around to the rear of this one in a moment. That's the letters of the company that puts it together. And I gather that French tank crewmen, quite often, if they had the opportunity, they'd take that plaque off, and there's actually Shermans later on when they're issued Shermans where they'd reapply that there. Now, one of the things we talked about earlier is, of course, this I come back to as well when everyone starts criticising things like this, just like when we talked about Hollywood movies and everything, it's a game. And so the speed the tanks go, the way they move off is not going to always be that accurate. And you talked earlier as well about the views, you know, how you see the vehicle, which obviously is not how a crew's going to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the observation things, so people say, what is realistic about it? Well, if you see the view on here at the moment, we can see really well. You'll see later on there's a bit of footage where they're actually firing the vehicles in there. The observation is good. But now you look at some of the observation ports on some of these vehicles. I mean, some of them are just mere slits that they can actually look through. And even in modern main battle tanks with, you know, thermal observation and gunnery systems and periscopes and episcopes, etc. You know, the viewing from there is particularly hard. So it's an absolute nightmare for any commander of any tank of any era to actually navigate around the battlefield, especially when you're closed down and everything else is going on. So you've got the radio chattering on your ears, your crew shouting at you, and you're obviously maybe in contact at that particular point as well.
And looking here, this is the tank we hadn't got in the arena. We saw Panzer III, this is a Panzer IV. Just going back to that design process bit, this was Panzer III and IV were the two tanks that the Germans were designing or putting together in the 1930s, and had real problems with getting them to production sort of standards, as it were, so they could actually make them in large enough numbers. This one with a short-barreled 75mm gun is the Panzer IV. The idea being it could fire high explosive. Wasn't really intended to take on enemy tanks, but if it had to, it could fire high explosive at them, and again they later gave them a high explosive anti-tank round, a heat round. But the irony here as well is the Panzer IV, Panzer III and Panzer IV, I've said it, they end up looking similar and have very similar capabilities, but the Panzer IV is the one they ended up adding the long-barreled 75mm gun to, and that almost takes over the role that the Panzer III was meant for. But we can see now, you know, what would you call this, jockeying, you know, for a fire position?
Yeah, like any tank. I mean, tank tactics have really not changed dramatically since the advent of a tank. And of course, we're seeing a tank working individually. Well, it would never happen. You'd never see a tank working out on their own. So whether you're working in a troop of 3 tanks or more, you've always got somebody as you're moving forward giving you cover and fire. You would always jockey, quite rightly said there, David, jockey off a fire position. So when you're in a fire position, you would always reverse, because obviously what could happen is the enemy has actually identified you, laid on the sights, and they're just waiting for you to move away. So to reverse up, move around a bit. Ground appreciation is always a big thing when travelling around, and that really does work well in the game as well. So you have to appreciate the ground, you have to appreciate where you can get the best fire position, and there's various positions you can get in a tank, whether it's, you know, turret down, hull down. What you really want to aim to do is just so that the gunner can actually see the target, and that's about it, and nothing else is facing the enemy. And obviously one of the critical points, and again exactly the same, where's the strongest point on any tank? The frontal armour is always the strongest, so it should always be that the front of the tank is always facing in the direction of the enemy threat. Sounds simple, but when you're actually navigating in a tank, closed down, you can't see anything, it may be the hole's going one direction, you know, the gunner's looking at something else, and you've got the radio chatter, it's not always easy. So they're minor points that actually do translate quite well from in-game to the real life scenario.
One of the things I'm always fascinated by was, you know, we saw the photograph of all these German soldiers in Afghanistan. They'd all dressed in their best bib and tucker. They were all lined up ready to play the game that evening. And, you know, for you, I know you say you worked on simulators and everything else down at Lulworth. You know, what is it that people a serving soldier could learn from playing this game, or is it they just play it? Because I know they all do. They play it just for the fun of it.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head for the fun of it. I mean, obviously in the British Army, we've worked with simulators forever for training, obviously, especially as the price of ammunition increases. Obviously track mileage is limited. We have to worry, again, even for newer vehicles, about using the tanks too much and the cost of repairs and everything. So simulation is dull, it's boring, and of course it doesn't compare to the adrenaline rush you can get when you're playing World of Tanks. So it's very, 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 very different.
And that, anyway, I mention those things because one of the issues that modern armies, you've just said it for me really, you know, the difference between what the soldiers train on as simulators, because of course your viewpoints there, you know, this idea that you can get everything under the sun, you can't, because the guy described to me like going to war in a tank like looking out of a letterbox, you know, with that thick glass on the front and everything else as well. That bit, that why the armies use simulators. But what's your thoughts on simulators as well? Because you taught it, because there's a difference there as well. You're not hungry, you're not lacking sleep, quite often that way, you know, you're not desperate to find the loo, you've got all those other, you haven't got a sweaty guy sitting next to you all the time that you're just wishing he'd change his socks. How does that differ when the simulation, you know, how do you actually make sure guys, or do you still do enough exercises that they get the gist of what the real thing is.
Yeah, I mean, times have obviously changed, and we've gone from things like, to whole fleet management, which was the idea. So at one stage, certainly when I first joined the army, you had a tank, and you lived and breathed that tank, even in peacetime, obviously, and everything else. But you had one tank that was dedicated to you. By the time I left, it was whole fleet management, which meant, the Challenger fleet was much lower. Tanks were being taken away by other units, and it wasn't quite the same. But you're quite right. Going back to your initial question on there, we talk a lot about stats and firepower and thickness of armor and that sort of thing, but ultimately at the end of the day it's all about training for the crew. Now there's a big thing throughout the army, whether it's tanks or otherwise, it's all about drill. So if somebody said to a tank soldier, fin tank on, the first thing they're going to think of is load a safety switch to safe, and then follows on the rest of their drill. It's so ingrained in you, and it's an automatic response to a familiar fire order is what they say about it. But again, I think it's stuff that we miss talking about, because you're quite right, a simulator is a simulator, and a simulator can teach you those drills. But of course, ultimately, when you're in conflict, when you're in operation, and of course we're also getting to the psychological level of it, it's very different engaging something in a screen is engaging something which actually could be full of people. Yeah. And the consequences of that as well.
So you're playing a game, obviously, with World of Tank guys back there who play the game. One of those things about that, yes, it is a game, yes, but you can learn things from that game and everything else. One thing that we make the point here all the time: you can have the best tank in the world, you must do it in the game all the time. Actually, unless you're a well-trained crew, i.e. a skilled player, presumably, that motivation behind that. And just as we always know, just having the best kit does not make you the most successful tank crew that's out there, as time and time again the historical examples in this museum have shown, and other issues as well that we're just talking about training. We're sitting here with King Tiger behind us in this our new World War II display. One of the issues about the King Tiger, about a third of them may have been lost towards the end of the war because the crews simply did not have that training time to get the best from that vehicle. And we were talking the analogy, if you've got a Formula One car outside the front of the museum, put your family car next to it. If you jump in a Formula One car, unless you've had all that training to get the best from that vehicle, you'll probably do a lap of our circuit here quicker in your family car than a Formula One. You need the skill set to get the best from that vehicle. And by the end of the war, the German crews just did not have the training time to get the best from some of these vehicles, which is why we think things like Panther, Tiger gearboxes being messed up. It may have been mechanical failures to a certain degree, but also the person wasn't skilled to be able to, read the landscape, use that gearbox in the right manner. But we've gone completely off target there, we've gone completely off track. You're going to ask me a question, or
I think we've got just enough time for a question or two for you. From James on YouTube, who dreamed up those complicated French camo schemes?
There is a brilliant book on French camouflage. If you go to our question and answer sessions, I mentioned that. We do a Patreon question and answer sessions as well. Just on camo as well, by the way, if you're interested, our Jagdpanther, that is a late war German camouflage scheme. Some of you have been asking questions about that. It's pretty much similar to the one we put on the Panther tank. What was basically happening is the Germans were running out of paint. And what you're seeing there is that red undercoat, which is the base coat that was always put on there, and then stripes, only a third. So the Germans actually called this scheme the third scheme because they only used about a third of the amount of paint they normally did. And there's pictures of Jagdpanthers with that scheme on towards the end of the war. Our Jagdpanther, by the way, was made in the factory by Remy right at the end of the war, with the German workers asked back. So basically it was a post-war production, for a number were made for the British to test. Right, we've got something else coming up.
And we're straight back into you again, David. We're back with Tanks in Action and late World War II vehicles, followed directly by the War Heritage Institute in Belgium and also the Canadian War Museum.
Right, so here we are looking at some of our other vehicles that we've got going around. This is our Churchill Mark IV. We've actually got a Churchill Mark III, Mark III driving around here. We are very lucky. We have a series of Churchill tanks that are on loan to us from the Churchill Trust. Hopefully, at the end of this, they'll be becoming a gift to the Tank Museum. There's a number of spares that came with them as well, and there you can see Bob driving with that tiller system on the Churchill. The Churchill is actually the fourth type of infantry tank that, dating back to what I was saying earlier, QLS in 1933 saying we need infantry tanks. Frontal armour on a Churchill, ended up being thicker than that on a Tiger I. You've got really good defence there, and on the turret here, we ended up going through a series of guns from the 2-pounder to the 6-pounder to the British 75mm gun. And this again was a tank that started life with an awful lot of teething troubles, but went on to be a very reliable vehicle, and because of its rate of climb was considered a real classic. It could actually get to places other tanks couldn't get to, and was of course converted as well into things like Avries. This is a British Comet. This is another type of tank British made. This is a cruiser. So this is a follow-on from that Crusader. And what you're looking at later in the war, we've got available now the Meteor tank engine, basically the Merlin. Early in the war it was being reserved, the Merlin obviously for aeroplanes to defend Britain and then bombers. But when they derate it, make the Meteor, that then becomes available, meaning that we've got a much more powerful tank engine that can then start going in the Cromwell and the Comet tank. And the Comet, that step frontage, we've got thick armour again. The whole point of that stepped front is to house the Panzer machine gun. This is the last tank they put that on, and with the first Centurions that are coming after the Comet, they decide, no, let's get for a smooth glacé plate instead of that step frontage where you've got the driver's viewport. But more importantly, what it was done is to have a 90-degree angle for the Panzer machine gun, you can see there. 77mm gun, the firepower is basically, they took the cartridge from a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, and it puts enough force behind an armour-piercing ballistic cap round to go through this tank, the Panther. That gun had actual better firepower and penetration when it's firing armour-piercing ballistic shot. So with a little sabot on there, with tungsten core, that was better at penetration than the 75mm on the Panther. Now this was the Panther that came across from the Musée de Blonde. This is the one that again was being used by the French army after the Second World War. It was captured from the Germans, actually used during the war as well, but Panthers equipped some of the first reformed French tank regiments. And the Panther really is an answer to when the Germans go into Russia and they meet the T-34. The Tiger's already been designed and going into service later that year, 1941. When they meet the T-34, it is genuinely a surprise for most of the German forces. There is a moment where they debate, shall we copy it directly? Being Germans, they have to go one better, and they come up with the Panther, which for many people is considered probably the best medium tank of the war. It's got superb sloped armour, it's got that very powerful 75mm gun you're looking at there, wide tracks, because again it's going to be used on the Eastern Front, the Maybach HL230P engine in the back to give it that power. Initially, at places like the Battle of Kursk, it has a lot of problems, teething troubles, but when they get a lot of these ironed out, this is a very, very effective tank. But we often mention, I've said it already, down to the cruise again, a lot of the time the Germans, amazingly, they are producing equipment as the war progresses. Albert Speer, you know, he's doing this fantastic reorganisation of the Germans' arms industry. He gets production going very, very well, but it's the men they're running out of and skilled crews. Now, we've been very lucky at TANKFEST to be able to put together, you know, whole groups of Sherman tanks, a classic American M4 Sherman of the Second World War, named, by the way, all the British named the American tanks after Civil War generals. So hence we got the Sherman, we got the Lee, the Grant, etc. Now the Sherman comes in an absolute plethora of formats, and so if you're a real rivet counter, look, that one's got a longer body, it must be X, Y, and Z. All of this because what they're doing, they cannot make enough Sherman tanks with the one type of engine, and they're building new factories, new companies are taking this on. So we have some with cast hulls, M4A1s with cast hulls, we've got welded hulls, we've got 4 different engine types, which means sometimes the body has to be lengthened, and later of course we've got improvements, different suspension systems, or here on our Fury tank, more powerful guns being added. So there is a great range of Sherman vehicles, and we were lucky to get some classics all together driving around our arena. This tank, of course, the tank we loaned to the making of the Brad Pitt war movie, Fury tank. We've left all the kit on it. You can see the difference there between the sharper hulled welded tanks and that smoother hulled cast hulled tanks of the Shermans. And this one as well, of course, has the 76mm gun on. Most earlier Shermans have the 75mm gun. The longer 76mm is a higher velocity gun. So it's not just that millimetre wider barrel, it's the amount of propellant in the case that forces the round out with more kinetic energy. That's that bigger difference there. Now here's the German Sturmgeschütz. The Sturmgeschütz were originally the idea of Manstein, German general in the mid-1930s. He's arguing infantry should have mobile artillery attacking with them, hence the design of this vehicle. Later in the war, we'll see one in a moment, they end up, instead of just putting that short-barreled howitzer to support the infantry on the tank, they put an anti-tank gun on it. And what you end up having is a very effective, there it is with a 75mm gun, a very effective tank with a low silhouette, or assault gun if you want to call it that way, or tank killer, because you could hide that vehicle easily in a hedge, knock out enemy tanks, and you can build 3 of these for the price of 2 turreted Panzer III tanks. So what we're looking at there is a very, very successful German design. For example, in Normandy, we always like talking about the bigger tanks, the Tigers, the King Tigers, etc. Actually, it's the Sturmgeschütz that knocks out more Allied tanks than any other type. So very popular vehicle. Now, here we are with 2 T-34-85s. Early in the war, what we're looking at with the T-34-76, beautifully built tanks just before the war. They're starting to come into service with the Red Army. A lot of them get knocked out, obviously, in those early days of the Barbarossa campaign in the summer of '41. The Russians have to move the factories behind the Ural Mountains, and in the process realise there's a lot of things that are going on a tank that aren't really necessary in combat. So they simplify the design. The tank gets cheaper to build as the war goes on, and in 1944 they come out with this, the T-34-85. Bigger turret, 3-man turret, as opposed to the earlier very cramped 2-man turret, and a bigger gun. Instead of the earlier we saw with the T-34-76, a 76mm gun, that later one has the 85mm gun. And they use the T-34 hull to make assault guns as well. Starting off again with the Su-85, that same gun that goes on the T-34, later in the second model of the T-34. Not worth having if we've got the same gun, so let's put a bigger gun on. So here we go with the Su-100, a 100mm gun, and this particular model, so underneath is basically the chassis of the T-34. This particular one was actually given to the Egyptians and was captured by British paratroopers at Suez in 1956. And it was brought back, and we've actually got records in the museum where it was given to the museum collection and then taken away again for some firing trials that the army were doing. So there you can see that diesel engine in the back, nice wide tracks, and also a very distinctive noise you'll hear with Russian tanks is a distinctive clack, clack, clack noise as it goes along. That's because of the pins being pushed back in by a wedge as they drive around. They're loose track pins. Another one for the games players here, this is Tortoise, and this was designed with the idea of that word again, assault tank. After D-Day, we thought we may have had to smash our way through things like German defences like the Siegfried Line. So huge, great cast frontage to it, and a 32-pounder gun. Now that gun is actually the next up from the 17-pounder. As an anti-tank gun, they actually fired one of these at a Panther, and the round went all the way through the front of the Panzer and exited the rear. So very accurate, very impressive vehicle, and we actually got this running with its meter engine in the back. It actually appeared at one of our tank fests driving around the place. So there we've got some of our vehicles. We're heading over now to have a look at a vehicle in Belgium and Canada.
The War Heritage Institute is Belgium's National Institute for War History, Heritage and Remembrance. We are proud to have one of the biggest collections of military objects in the world. The participant in this virtual tank fest for today is part of the collection of the War Heritage Institute at our location in the Bastogne Barracks. This is where we keep our collection of World War II vehicles, and it's also the spot where we have the Vehicle Restoration Center where we restore vehicles. The Sherman Jumbo that is participating in this video has been restored over the period of about 2 years. The restoration was finished in December 2019, just in time for our NUTS event in December. The tank also participated in our big Liberation Column South, which was a remembrance project for the liberation of the Ardennes after the Ardennes offensive. We tried to keep as close as possible to the original tank that broke the encirclement of Bastogne in December 1944. And we also hope to present this vehicle to you in person in the next edition of the live TANKFEST. In the meantime, keep safe, keep healthy, and when you're in Belgium, make sure to visit one of our sites. Thank you.
So here is the Belgian M4A3E2, and they're starting up that Ford V8 gasoline engine. So it's a petrol engine in the back of this model of the Sherman. And this particular one, they've marked it up as Cobra King. We'll talk about that in a moment. But so what is a jumbo Sherman? The Americans, just like the British with the Tortoise, thought we may have to assault some very well defended and prepared positions, and therefore you're going to need tanks that have that much extra protection on, because they're going to be that much more of a target. And what they did with the M4A3E2 on this particular model, the jumbo model, they add more armour protection. So another inch plate's added on, you end up with 4 inches on that front plate, and it's got the newer type turret on it. Now that means this tank becomes slower. It slows it down by about 6 miles an hour because of that extra armour there, and it's overall about 6 tons heavier than the standard Sherman. Same gun as the standard Sherman with a 75mm, it's just those protection levels go up for the use they envisaged it. They make about 254 of them, 250 are sent off to Europe, and they arrive in about September of 44. And as mentioned, this particular model, this one ended up as a memorial tank by the side of the road after the Second World War. Some years later, when it was going to be recovered, when they approached the Americans actually wanted it back. They said, look, can we have this back? And the Belgium War Heritage Institute ended up saying, look, can we keep it? We'll restore it and we'll keep it running. And that's exactly what they've done here. And they've done it up as Cobra King, which is the first tank that got into Bastogne by Patton's relieving force. So it's they've done it quite rightly, you know, because they're based at Bastogne and they've been going through these memorial commemorations over the last year or so. Now this, again, amazingly, Cobra King, the real tank that was the first one into Bastogne, it was kind of lost for a while and then identified it was a range wreck, and that's now back at Fort Benning in America, and we'll see Fort Benning in a little while's time. So another one of those variations of a Sherman's that's ended up, this one I think is the only running jumbo Sherman now in the world, so quite a piece, and this went through a 2-year restoration out in those workshops that we're seeing there out at Bastogne. It's a big army base that they've now opened up, and it's the site of one of their museums. There's also some of the tanks and some of the vehicles are actually on display in Brussels. That's where you used to go to see the tank collection. You should really go to Bastogne these days to see the collection there. So a bit of a rarity driving along there. Mentioned before, there's that star on the side, not just an American symbol. All the Allies, after D-Day, we've got stars that indicates an Allied vehicle. So here's the M4A3E2 version of the Sherman coming towards us there, coming to the end of this little piece that the Belgians have put together for us.
Located in Ottawa, Canada, the nation's capital, the Canadian War Museum is Canada's national museum of military history. The museum promotes a deeper public understanding of the human experience of war. Since its opening in 2005, the museum has welcomed approximately 500,000 visitors annually. There is a research center, a theatre, and a memorial hall with the headstone of Canada's unknown soldier. While our focus is on Canadians in times of war and peace, we have a rich collection of military artifacts, rare vehicles, unique medals, and works of art comprising, in total, more than 3 million objects. The Military Technology Collection is housed in Le Breton Gallery, one of the museum's most popular destinations. A workshop is located next to the gallery for the restoration and maintenance of vehicles. In this open exhibition space, we have 200 large artifacts, including tanks, aircraft, and armored vehicles. This is the finest collection of military vehicles in Canada. We hope you'll enjoy our footage of the Canadian-made Ram Kangaroo that you will see in action in a moment. And we hope that you will someday have a chance to visit us at the Canadian War Museum.
Now you can see here a Ram tank. It's basically, many people think of it almost like a variant of the Sherman that was built in Canada. It's got parts and components that were used on the M3 Grant tank. They don't see combat action, only some are used in Europe. They're mainly used in Europe as training tanks. But what happens is General Simmons, who's in charge of the 2nd Canadian Corps, in Normandy, he actually gets M7 Priests with their 105mm guns. They're being replaced by Sextons with 25-pounders. So he thinks these will be useful vehicles if he plates over where the gun used to go on the M7, and they call them a Kangaroo. They put a section of infantry in them, and they use about 50 of them for Operation Totalize in the attack in Normandy. It's a great idea, seems to work. So they go back to Canada, where a number of Ram tanks at the Montreal Locomotive Works are quickly converted, turrets off, and they're made into a useful armoured personnel carrier. And that's what we're seeing, that the Canadian War Museum restores here in front of us. That's what we're looking at now. 10 infantrymen in the back. You could have a commander, a driver, and sometimes someone operating that little turret that's on the side there with a Browning machine gun in. In the back of it, it's got that R975 radial engine, you know, the aeroplane engine that was used on a lot of the Sherman variants, and gives it so it can keep up with the tanks. It's got the same traction, the same sort of sense of mobility, and they're used by the 79th Armoured Division, and they form specially the 1st Canadian Armoured Personnel Company Regiment back in September of '44. And you can see on the vehicle, so Marion 2, the name on the side given by the troops, there's that recognition star we talked about earlier. And as the vehicle goes around, you'll see the unit insignia, 157, that's this Canadian Armoured Personnel Carrier unit. And you can also see the little triangle with a bull's head in, that's 79th Armoured Division we talked about earlier. Now these vehicles, crewed by Canadians, they are used throughout the rest of the war. Very successful design adaptation led by the Canadians there. And the idea Kangaroo, you only have to think about it, it's a name, a vehicle with a pouch, or an animal, sorry, with a pouch, marsupials. So from that side of things, Kangaroo is a name stuck for whatever variant they're using going along there. And there you can see that radial engine having started up, fires out a fair old bit of smoke there at the rear, but a fantastic vehicle put together and restored to life by the Canadians.
We hope you enjoyed our restored Ram Kangaroo. To learn more about the Canadian War Museum and how you can support us, please follow us on social media or visit our website.
Well, 2 other collections there, quite stunning ones. I've not been to the Canadian one. We've met Jim, who's in charge of the Canadian Museum, and his engineers have been over here as well. But that's an amazing restoration, and what a vehicle collection they've got. And of course the Belgians, which is another one of those countries, which is just because it's been basically the gateway for different armies crossing Europe for centuries. Yeah. So, you know, if you go to their Waterloo exhibits, if you go to their Second World War, they've got amazing bits and pieces. So again, 2 collections, if you do have the opportunity, definitely worth visiting. And we've put links to their sites and these supporting museums who've given us. If you go to tankfest.org And again, you'll be able to follow through some of the links that we've been saying earlier, things to the shop, things of how you can support us on Patreon, how you can buy things, how you can join some of our schemes, you know, as become a member of the Tank Museum, etc. So do have a look at tankfest.org.
A few more questions, David.
Right.
For you, let me, from Slime Zock, I think, on Twitch. If there was one tank that you could have, or you could get for the museum, what would that be? Anything at all?
Anything at all. We have a wants list for the Tank Museum.
Can I guess one?
Debate, go on, far away.
Abrams.
An Abrams is on that. We've been working away with the Americans for goodness knows how many years, trying to get an Abrams here. We're going to see an Abrams a little bit later on, so we'll see that one. But yeah, for me, there's some vehicles that we are lacking that might not even be, so we want the glamorous one. You know, we haven't got a late war, something like a JS2, JS3 or T-Tank, one of those big heavy Soviet tanks. That would be a great one to have because we can then show that's why Britain develops the Conqueror as an Overwatch tank. The Americans developed the M103, similar sort of thing with a whopping great 120 gun on. So having one of those tanks, we want a Leclerc, we want all the, you know, a Merkava. There's so many there. For me, some of those rarities, things like an Indian pattern carrier. India ended up making an armoured vehicle that goes and sees service in North Africa. It almost looks like a Daimler armoured car with the top off. And that sees service at Alamein, North African battles, but then they're shipped back. They don't come to the UK, they don't fight in Northwest Europe, so they go out to Burma, etc. And we know there's a couple in Afghanistan in a scrapyard, that sort of thing. Those are the sort of vehicles, because that means we can bring in much more of the Commonwealth story, which is a vital story. You know, if we're telling World War II British story here, Commonwealth, we just saw about the Canadian contribution. You know, there's Polish armoured, there's the Indian armoured forces as well. There's so much there that we want to add. So I'd go for one of those slightly more obscure one, like an Indian pattern carrier.
From Neil on Facebook, is the Sherman's reputation as a death trap justified?
Utter tosh. Just stop asking those silly questions about the Sherman. The Sherman is one of those tanks that was, who won? That's the question I put to you. It was a brilliant piece of engineering design that perfectly fitted the problem of the day. 30-ton tanks, I've said it already, had to get across the Pacific, across the Atlantic. Yes, it is not a like-for-like match to late war German tanks, but when it first came into service, Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, said these tanks are better than ours. So that was a German evaluation of the Sherman. So this idea that we constantly say, yes, if you're hit, any tank goes up in flames. What it was about the Sherman as well, this idea that actually when they come up with wet stowage, protect the ammunition, hence those extra side plates put on, that helps it as well. Let's be careful, we don't just keep repeating the same old, no, they were death traps, they were Tommy Clippers, they were this. They were the tanks that helped the Western Allies win the war.
Stevie, Facebook, will we ever see a Tiger II running at TANKFest?
Watch this space. Let's just keep hoping about things like that. We have 2 Tiger IIs at the Tank Museum. It would be a phenomenal thing for us to be able to run a Tiger I and a Tiger II here. There is a Tiger II running at Souma, another one of these Production King Tigers. You know, so you can get to see one if you're lucky enough that way. We'd love to see one run at the Tank Museum too.
And we've got 30 seconds, David, in this slot, and we're going to get lynched by your staff otherwise. Merchandise?
I do, so come back to. So if you want to buy, so I know if you're games players, amazingly, we've actually got books on World of Tanks. So I know you like it. Some people, if you're like me, you want a book in your hand. Things we can recommend. If you just want a good intro to the history of the tank, our guidebook, that's a good one there. So we've got a very good, just simple history, but it's got all those other things you want to know about, how guns work, how systems, engines, bits about how do you go to toilet in a tank. We've done on that. That's our new guidebook. So have a look at that. I think it's a £5 on our shop. That's another one of those books I'd always try and promote. The Tank book by Dorling Kindersley. We put it together, stunning collection of imagery in there, whether you're a real tank nerd or just a beginner. That's another one of those ones. And behind me, I know we've got a number of our Haynes manuals, which if you're interested in tanks, they go into a lot more detail. So I know you've got Chieftain, Challenger.
Love the Haynes manuals, recommend them highly.
Really good detail, beautifully illustrated, whether you're a model maker, whether you've got historic interest, that's the sort of thing you want. So lots of our books here. That's one of our Haynes on the Tiger. We'll come back to some of the other bits in another bit session.
Moving straight on then, we go into our next deathmatch, 2 tank icons. We've got the Tiger versus the T-34-76.
So where are we now?
More game footage, David, more game
Right.
footage. So this particular one, again, visions there. We talked a bit about this actually earlier on. Obstacles, as far as tank obstacles are concerned.
Yeah, so when we first looked at this one, when we're thinking about things like, we're going to see a Tiger in a T-34 76, the Battle of Kursk on the Eastern Front, often talked by people about the biggest tank battle of all time. Was it? There may have been bigger battles earlier in the invasion. But the Russians had an opportunity because Western intelligence, Britain, we've broken the Enigma codes, we're feeding this intelligence to the Russians. They know that the Germans are going to put in an attack that tries to pinch off this massive bulge on the Eastern Front line. And the Russians have time to prepare. And because the Germans are preparing new tanks like the Panther, the Ferdinand or Elephant, they've already got Tiger tanks there, the delays, it's literally month delays from Hitler's point of view before the attack goes in the summer of 43. So the Russians prepare massive anti-tank defensives. So you've got things such as blocks, tank ditches, minefields to try and channel the tanks towards certain things. And it's only after the anti-tank guns, the minefields, etc., only then will you release your armour to plug any breakthrough that the Germans have made. And looking here, you see, we've seen here a Tiger I, stunningly effective in terms of 10 centimetre thick frontal armour, the 88mm gun, that can take on enemy tanks at about 1,000, even 2,000 metres away, so about 2 kms away. Very, very effective bit of kit. But if you slow it down by making your engineers have to come forward, building a quick temporary breach, a minefield, a tank ditch that they've got to fill in to get over, those are all going to be things that are going to slow down and cause real problems for the Germans.
And even with the advent of hydrogas suspension as the years progressed, etc., I mean, still obstacles for us are one of the, the greatest dramas. There are different ways nowadays compared to here with the improvements in suspension, but also I think what people forget sometimes is it's not just the obstacle will stop them. I mean, also crews do not want to damage their vehicles. The last thing you want to be doing in a firefight is to get out to replace a broken track pin or a snapped link or something. So it's very important. And of course, from a tactical perspective, like you said, David, the idea is from an enemy perspective, channel the tanks through there, put a minefield where they're all going to drive through, blast it with artillery, and that'll do the trick very, very quickly. So obstacles are fantastic, and they've changed so much, the variety, but nothing actually beats it. From going back to World War II, some of the teeth type traps and things, so very effective.
Yeah, and again, looking on the game, obviously I gather you do have artillery in the game, but this idea that obviously the game is tank on tank, so that's the focus of this game. One of the things we always like to remember is actually tanks quite often can be a very effective tank, but that's not in the role of fighting another tank. They can be attacking infantry positions, they can be attacking artillery, they can be doing their job without having to fight another tank, and the vast majority of tanks are knocked out, not surprisingly, by another tank, but by anti-tank guns. And of course, one of the other issues that, again, we can see in the game here, one of the points we were trying to make all the time is, yes, that Tiger, however good a tank it is, when you're ending up having so many of those Soviet T-34 tanks, you can end up being swamped on the battlefield. And that's one of those other things that, however good your tank, if something can get round behind you, put a round up where the armour's thinner on the side, or where you're done for.
And again, it all goes down to position. Ideal tank shooting position was enfilade fire from a defilade position. That was always hammered home to you all the time. And funnily enough, artillery, when you look at the game, it's the last thing you want to do when you're talking about artillery in real life is pick a prominent feature. So when they're taking cover behind the only tree that's there, square kilometre, one tree, don't take cover behind it. It's an easy place for a forward artillery observer to actually lay fire down onto.
So looking at, I said I'm going to come back to some of our wonderful objects here. I know you're all admiring this round next to me. This here is not actually a round, it's actually a flask. So if you want to, don't every little boy, and maybe certain girls, are going to want this to take to work on Monday morning. So there, get one of those from the shop. And behind me, we just talked there about the 88mm. Why not get your inflatable 88mm round from the Tank Museum shop? Or, if you want to go for the British, here we go. This is the inflatable 17-pounder armour-piercing ballistic capped round. There with the red band on, that means it's got the tracer. It just shows there's some sort of explosive present. So there's some other nice things you might want to have a look at from our shop. Richard, sorry.
That's absolutely fine. So coming up, we've got the curator. No, sorry, I always say the curator. It's because I expect you to be talking about everything.
Of course.
Mr. Richard Smith is actually going to give us a look at Tiger 131 inside and outside. Now, obviously, Tiger 131, David, am I right in saying the most iconic, or I will get hung if I say that down in the museum?
It's a tricky one because, again, from our point of view, every museum wants that iconic item that everyone draws attention to. When the restoration process began back in the 1990s with the Tiger, it was with a view. It was going to be a restoration that would help put the Tank Museum on the map in a certain way. And through that restoration process, I only came here in 2000, took over that early restoration of the tank. And it's done, I would argue, the job they set out to do, because it's made this place more famous. It's the only running Tiger 1. I'm sure in the future there'll be these what they call Franken Tigers, tanks made out of bits and all sorts of things coming together. There's others going to be really interesting tanks running. But the key thing, that was the first bit of really big, heavy German armour that was running in Britain, and certainly in terms of the focus of attention has been drawn to that tank. Even though we've got more famous, bigger, look, there's a King Tiger behind us, there's all sorts of other amazing vehicles here in this museum. So I think they were right to choose it. And we discussed earlier, things like, why is it the Tiger? I made a model when I was a kid of the
I did
Tiger,
as well, yeah, absolutely. Passion for the Tiger.
Yeah, so what is that thing about it? Is it the way it looks? I know there's stories about it, but there's great stories about other tanks in our collection and other collections. So I always wonder, is it that shape it's got, which is that really sturdy, boxy shape that I always describe, like a boxer, it could step back and, take a punch as well as give a punch with that massive 88mm gun. Our particular tank with that great Tunisian story of its capture, you can see the battle damage, all layering on top of it, but very hard to absolutely pin down why the Tiger 1 is the tank that everybody can identify, everybody seems to know about, and certainly if you're a model maker or whatever, a schoolboy, whatever, Tiger, maybe even 131, we say without bravado, probably the most famous tank in the world now.
And every reference material I've ever read, every book, every action record that we've seen from the units, when they mention Tiger 1, they're always you can almost read and sense the fear when they're actually doing it, which is incredible, because obviously a lot of them, because there wasn't a lot, never came across them, never came one-to-one with them, certainly.
Yeah, so that idea of Tiger Fright in Normandy, this idea that anything boxy in a hedge, back off lads, fire smoke, and let's just move out and we'll get the artillery in, or hopefully the RAF will come over. So that idea of Tiger Fright, absolutely, it's a well-documented sensation. But as you say, in some areas, there just aren't the Tigers they're fighting. They're drawn onto the British and Canadian front in Normandy. No Tigers at all facing the Americans. And yet, inevitably stories will be about that. And you're not going to question the veteran in any way, in the wrong way at all. But the truth is, it probably wasn't a Tiger because there just weren't that many of them around the place. But as we always say, if you had bumped into a Tiger, boy, you're going to remember it, sort of thing. They are the tank that, again, if you saw your round bounce off, you're not going to be trying to sort of take that on. At the same time, we've met veterans who, once they'd worked out their tactics, they were confident they knew how they were going to deal with tanks like that in the future. So, again, like everybody's experience of the Second World War, it was unique to that individual. We've got, we tend to group it together in groupthink. That's fine to a certain degree. But you've got different people having very different experiences as tank crews, and you only have to look at Joe Eakin Sherman, taking out 3 Tigers in an afternoon and then popping off for a Panzer IV a bit later on. That sort of thing. Are they going to have that same sensation as if you're perhaps earlier at Villers-Bocage, where you've seen a whole column taken out by a Tiger? So different experiences.
Well, keeping on Tiger 131 theme, it's now over to the director of the Tank Museum, Mr. Richard Smith, and Tiger 131 inside and out.
There are some objects that come to define the richness of a museum's collection. We tend to call these hero objects. These are things like the Mona Lisa for the Louvre, the Rosetta Stone for the British Museum, and for the Tank Museum, one of these is Tiger 131. Now, it's not technically necessarily the most important tank in the collection. It's not necessarily the best tank in the collection. For some of us, it's not our favourite tank in the collection, but it is the most famous tank in the collection. In this video, we're going to look at why Tiger 131 is not merely the most famous tank in the museum, but arguably the most famous tank in the world. Now, many of you watching this video will know that the reputation of the Tiger is as much based on myth and appearance as reality, but this vehicle embodies the key messages of the Nazi propaganda machine, of Hitler's obsessions with size and scale and strength and power. What the German tank designers revealed on Hitler's 50th birthday certainly looked the part, and it sent a shudder through the Allies when they saw this monstrous new machine featuring in Nazi newsreels of April 1942. Now, there's no doubt that the British were alarmed by the scale, size and power of this new German vehicle, but it was going to be a year before they could get their hands on one of the real things. In Tunisia in April 1943, Tiger 131 was abandoned after an engagement with the Sherwood Foresters and 48 Royal Tank Regiment. It was the first Tiger to be captured intact by the Western Allies and was considered a really important prize, to the extent where it was inspected both by Churchill and King George VI while it was still in Tunisia, and then shipped to London where it was displayed on Horse Guards Parade. Tiger crews had orders to destroy disabled tanks rather than let them fall into enemy hands, so it remains a certain amount of mystery around why Tiger 131 was abandoned. But recent research by the Bournemouth University Forensics Department suggests that because of the way the tank was damaged to its open hatches, at least 3 of the crew were probably wounded. The engine was recorded as later on as easily overheating, so the engine was probably broken and probably not working at the point where the tank was abandoned. And the last straw was when the turret was disabled following a round jamming between the turret and the hull. The crew gave up and went to the rear. And that meant that the Tiger was captured intact and its secrets could be revealed. But with hindsight, perhaps the Tiger is a tank that never lives up to its hype. It's a tank where those upsides are outweighed by the downsides. Yes, it has a tremendous psychological impact on the battlefield just by being out there somewhere. It indeed has the best gun in the world in this tremendously powerful 88mm. At the time, it has the best armour in the world, and its mobility is perfectly adequate. But there are just too few Tigers for this to be a war-winning weapon. And these tanks are an economic disaster zone, and they are so expensive, and weapons like this are so expensive, that they lead to a direct contribution to the downfall of the Nazi regime. The propaganda around the Tiger was highly successful. It kept Allied crews in a permanent state of what was known as Tiger terror, of fear of encountering one of these ferocious machines. And you could even argue that the ripples of that Tiger terror, of that effect on our soldiers then, make us now remain victims of Nazi propaganda, even 75 years later. There were just too few of them, and they were too intensive in their maintenance requirement for them to ever dominate the battlefields of the Second World War. You have to ask yourself, if Tiger tanks were so good, how come so few survive to this day? No one chose to remanufacture these things after the Second World War, and no one chose to operate them. And of over 1,300 produced, only 6, of which Tiger 131 is one of them, survive to this day. Of those 6, it's the only one that still runs, and this was after a major and complex and expensive project to return the tank to running condition. Compare this to the large number of T-34s and Shermans still in good running order after all these years. Yes, there were more T-34s and Shermans, so the spares availability is better. But there's more to it than that, and we should know. The Tiger tank takes an absurd amount of maintenance, and it's difficult and expensive to fix when something goes wrong. Today we run Tiger 131 twice a year to take part in our Tiger Day events, and Tiger Day attracts thousands of visitors from all over the world to see this unique vehicle in action. It's something you cannot see anywhere else. No other tank in our entire collection could carry a show on its own like Tiger 131 could, and for us as a museum it's great to see the enjoyment and the engagement that this tank brings. But most people never get a chance to see what goes on behind the scenes to make that kind of event possible.
It is over-engineered, it is complex in ways, but at the same time it is wartime technology. But yeah, you can't just go to the Maybach dealer and say, oh, can we have some new cylinder heads? But yeah, it is a bit more complex than your average T-34 or Sherman, but I guess that also makes it a bit of an engineering challenge. So you build a knowledge of the vehicle and how it behaves, and you can react to it, and you start to notice fairly quickly if something is out of sync with how it normally runs. So you build up knowledge of operating it that way. Of course, Mike and some of the others were involved with the engine overhaul, the engine that's running it now. So you have a lot better knowledge once you help assemble and build that motor. You can more easily identify a problem because you know exactly how it works. So we take it out before it goes out to Tiger Day these days. We service the vehicle if needed, and we run it up to temperature to make sure everything performs for the following week, for the big event when obviously several thousand people are standing in the arena. The last thing you want is to find out there's a problem there and then.
When I first drove it, I'd be lying to say if I wasn't nervous. Who wouldn't be nervous driving, a 70-year-old tank, the only running one in the world, and all eyes are on you. So yeah, I was nervous. Actually, it's really nice to drive. The only thing is the restricted vision. You've got to have someone on the ground that you can really trust. Where Mike been involved with Tiger for so long, so we've always had an understanding. Inside when you're driving it, it's so noisy. It is really noisy because you've got the transmission right next to you. It's quick for an old tank. It's very quick. I can get it up into 6th gear, and it feels like you're doing 100 miles an hour really, but it is quite scary inside. Yeah, but it is a quick bit of kit. We found with the Tiger, after driving it, there's things that need adjusting because this is quite finely tuned for this gear change to operate. And what I've learnt in the past, I just give a little bit of clutch, just assist, because if you get it wrong, the tank can rear up and it can snatch the tracks. And we've only got the one set of tracks on Tiger. We can't afford for them to take in that much pressure, and damaging the tracks and the final drives. I've got to drive it right, and to make it look good, because Tiger Days, everyone's got a camera, they want to see it perform, they want to hear it change gear, they want to see it manoeuvre, and so yeah, it is an experience to drive around and get it right. It's all for the visitors really, and for us, we're all tank nuts at heart, so it's just an enjoyment.
Like with most historic machinery, it makes I always keep saying it makes it three-dimensional. Once you see it running, but it's so unique and it brings it to life. You start thinking, what was it like for these guys on the Eastern Front or wherever they operated the vehicle? In this case, of course, North Africa as well. What was it like for these guys on 131? They would have heard that exact same engine sound out of the exact same vehicle. So it makes not only a link to the past, but it gets you to understand what these vehicles are about. Not only as an impressive feat of engineering, but also quite a sinister and impressive weapon. And that would be a different experience if it just sits there. We all get that. So once you see it doing a lap in the arena, it is impressive. And especially when it goes out by itself, because it's just this one machine in the arena. And you think very few other vehicles will have this real dominance of the territory always. The museum has made the vehicle famous, and we continue to build the history of that vehicle. People come to the museum sometimes just to see the Tiger. It is impressive, and of course we want to share that with people. That's our job as a museum. We want to share history, and that also means the history of the object and how it operates. It's the only survivor intact with its combat history, so you want to make sure that it's being looked after. We will try 200% effort to make sure we can save the original rather than replace it, and that's why this balance of keeping it running with keeping the original components is very important to us, and I think it also will be to the visitors, because they want to know it's the real deal. We're losing the veterans now, unfortunately. We have done the last last few years, unfortunately, with these great individuals, and in some ways the machinery outlives them, and maybe that's part of remembering them as well when it comes down to operating these machines. Despite all the work we do in servicing and maintaining and repairing the vehicle, we obviously realize that one day we may have to park the vehicle up in the museum and let it live the rest of its life in retirement.
So Tiger 131 was originally returned to running order for TANKFEST in 2004 following a huge internal and external restoration, and it made it around the arena just. This was an immensely difficult project, but we were feeling our way in the dark through the unknown. We didn't have access to anyone with experience of operating and maintaining the vehicle. We had to learn for ourselves. Indeed, some of the 2004 work got revisited in 2010, and we continue to improve the way we look after the vehicle as we learn more about it. I mean, there was no Haynes manual for the Tiger then, although by a happy coincidence, there is now, and this handy guide will help you do your own Tiger rebuild projects in the future. And there are a few rebuild projects currently underway, so Tiger 131 won't be the only running Tiger tank forever, but none of the other ones will have the authenticity of Tiger 131. Because what makes Tiger 131 such an important piece for our museum is its story, and it's that story and the continuity of its existence which is at the core of its value as an artefact. Just look at Tiger 131 and you can see what makes it different to the other Tigers, because it still bears the scars of its final battle. It has the field modifications made by the crew. We even have a photograph of them, although to this day we don't know who they were. And we know what happened in its final fighting moments, giving this tank a very human dynamic. We know that in the advanced tuners, infantry from the Sherwood Foresters Regiment took a hill known as Point 174 from the Germans. The inevitable German counterattacks culminated in an assault of German armour, among which was Tiger 131. The infantry at this point were exhausted and were surely set to be overrun, but 500 yards behind them, 9 Churchill tanks from 48 Royal Tank Regiment and 142 Royal Armoured Corps arrived on the battlefield just in time to fire on the advancing enemy tanks. In a dangerously precarious situation and unaware of the Churchills taking up positions behind them, the Sherwood Foresters turned an abandoned German anti-tank gun and prepared to fire at Tiger 131. And in the following exchange of fire, a Churchill tank is knocked out and Tiger 131 ground to a halt, having been hit multiple times. Almost 80 years on, Tiger 131 is no longer a feared weapon of war, but a treasured artefact. But our story doesn't stop there. Because of its story, and because it's the only running example in the world, Tiger 131 has become more than just a museum exhibit. If you take a look at YouTube and search for Tiger 131, you'll see literally thousands of videos which have been viewed millions of times, and this makes it one of the most visible and viewed artefacts of any kind in any museum anywhere in the world. This level of fame meant that when the movie director David Ayer wanted a real Tiger tank to feature in the film Fury, a brief Google search was all that it took to find Tiger 131. And Tiger 131 can add itself to the distinguished list of Hollywood performers who are also World War II veterans. This appearance brought yet more fame, and Tiger 131 subsequently then became immortalised even in pixels, being a tank you can play yourself in the World of Tanks game. And then bricks, and then a whole range of fan merchandise. Tiger 131 draws new admirers every day, and the fascination it generates brings visitors to the Tank Museum and draws people to our subject area of armoured warfare. The cultural value of Tiger 131 is far in excess of what you would expect from an individual vehicle. The tank's sheer popularity and the way in which we've been able to harness it directly enables us to tell the story of tanks and the men who fought in them. Preserving this tank doesn't mean that we're glorifying either the Tiger or the regime that made it. In fact, quite the opposite. Preserving this tank enables us to open up a chapter of history, to tell the stories of those that had to overcome this regime, of the nature of that regime itself, and the way in which tanks like the Tiger and their extraordinary expense helped to bring it down to the benefit of all of us 75 years later.
David, a question that crops up very often at Tiger 131, certainly about some of the other tanks that you run on the arena, certainly TANKFEST days and other times. Do you really think you should be running them, considering the age and the fact that, let's face it, there is going to be one day a stage where one of these breaks, and probably a catastrophic, you know, it's not going to get repaired, you haven't got the parts for it?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because I come from a fine art background, looking after fine art works in galleries and everything, and there's a really strong convention about how you're supposed to preserve, look after, restore works of art. For 20th century mass-produced industrial items, we just don't have that same set of guidance. So you imagine going to a clock museum and not seeing any mechanical clock in that museum working, you might feel a bit shortchanged. So there's some areas of technological history we're used to seeing working. There's other areas where, you know, the aeroplanes is a classic area where we've got real problems of if a plane fails, it not only drops out the sky, but you lose a pilot as well, and no one's life's you know, worth losing just for that sake of trying to put things in front of the public. So, you know, so there's different elements. Now with tanks, one of the things we know that running a tank is really important to helping people understand some of those issues about it. But let's not kid ourselves, you know, we're not using the guns, we're not firing at ranges, we're not doing all sorts of things. So we're only explaining some of the things by running it. And we do also know one of the other problems we've all got as well is we know that by running it, we're damaging it. What we are trying to do though is we know all these objects we're looking after on a downward curve, they are going to sort of return to base oxide one day in the future. All we're doing is slowing that up. At points, by speeding that up, by running the vehicle, doing certain things to do with it, but by bringing so many people to the subject. And you know, another one of these issues, if we hadn't run the Tiger when we did, we would have lost those people who were there when it was captured, who knew about it, knew some of the stories, etc. So again, running these vehicles in 20 years' time, it'll be a very different, it will have been gone from living memory. So there's a whole host of issues that you come into. And my own feeling is that some organisations criticise other ones for running things, etc. My own thought is, look at that particular organisation, look at its remit, look at what it's there for. You know, we try to do it with the least wear and tear as possible, but equally, what are we trying to save? What's significant about that vehicle? Host of really complex issues there, but think about that as well for viewers, which is, you know, what are we trying to do when when people are saying, oh, run this, run that. That's not our complete aim. You know, running is part of it, but that's, you know, it's also preservation.
And we've just, very quick question. AC-1 Sentinel, do you think it would have been a good if it had gone into production?
Well, amazing enough. So this is an Australian tank built out in Australia, and they actually experimented with a 17-pounded version. That was some firepower on, you know, the Sentinel. So yes, I think push comes to shove, and in the part of the world, what it was to be going up against, Japanese tanks, it would have done the job, you know, because it wasn't going up against a Panther or a Tiger or something. So, you know, fine.
And we're straight into our next and final death match, which is the IS-2 versus the King Tiger.
So here we are. Where are we? This is Switzerland.
It's Switzerland.
What are we doing on Heidi?
It's in the Alps.
in the Alps?
A scenario, it's not in the Alps, I was jesting there, David, but I mean, a scenario, obviously the maps represent different climates, different temperatures, not something I've ever experienced, I have to say, and I'm quite happy that I haven't experienced ever fighting in
I have
Arctic
to say,
conditions.
sorry, naively, the graphics look stunning, don't they? They do really do look like, you know, this is some holiday guide, and then all of a sudden the King Tiger appears.
Yeah, and the question we get asked quite a lot, obviously, about the game is also the research for each individual vehicle, and I don't think we've really touched much on that. It is a fantastic team that are dedicated to doing the research on there, scouring archives across the globe,
Including ours?
Including yours. Obviously, many of your vehicles have actually appeared in game. I think of Tiger 1 3 on obviously springs at the top of the mind. And it is a long process to research some of these vehicles. You know, 4 to 6 months on average for one vehicle to actually get it in game by the time it's modelled and everything. So it's very, very accurate. It used to be the old days, we'd turn up at the museum with a pencil and a notebook and actually spend a couple of weeks there and measure everything. Now, of course, slightly more sophisticated with 3D scanning and everything.
So here, obviously, this is what we're looking at, is what's behind us, the production King Tiger. R1, by the way, all that Ripley surfaces, Zimmerit, it's that anti-magnetic pace that was put on. They stopped doing it in September of 44 because they realised it was a waste of time. No one had magnetic mines to actually attach to the vehicle. But here we can see in the game one of your production King Tigers there. And a JS2. What we're looking at, a JS2 on the game there?
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I actually have to say one of my favourite tanks to play in-game. It's a punchy vehicle, very, very popular with the player base as well. And really, really good. I think the good thing here as well, we talk about camo, one thing we have been asked to press a bit more is the fact that people can go out there and buy the Panther, buy the Panther camo as well to actually put on in-game. Don't forget all the proceeds are going to yourself in the museum. But you can see there some of this, I think there's a bit of flicker on there, but some of the graphics on the HD are stunning. We talked about observation a lot, we talked about everything else, but what about crew comfort? Now, crew comfort is notoriously bad on most of the Soviet vehicles. And again, I think crew comfort from a perspective of tank design was obviously was overlooked for so many years. We always thought about firepower, protection, mobility, but we didn't actually think about much else on there. Now, obviously, if you haven't got a happy crew, it is, over a long period of time, become detrimental to that particular crew. So crew comfort is important.
Yeah, because we were talking about, you know, like German ergonomics, that idea the commander was like with a Panzer IV and the Panzer III centre at the back of the turret, so you've got a good cupola, good vision compared to many other tanks today. And they're seeing as Soviet tanks, you know, one of the things that's often, you know, commented on, sometimes argued hotly about, is did the Soviets have a different attitude to their citizens, their you know, soldiers as they were going in? Because one of the issues, you know, we always talk about 5'8" maximum height for a Soviet tank crewman, whereas of course in the West we're building for certain the 95th percentile, etc. So in other words, in the West we tend to build a vehicle that unless you are in that last 5% category, you know, i.e. you're 7'2", we're not going to build it for that. But obviously the Soviet, you know, so the internal volume of the tank had to be less. And you look in some of the Soviet vehicles, you've been in a T-72, haven't you? You know, there's space in there.
Yeah, I drove a T-72, and I have to say, I mean, I'm not, you know, I'm 5'10", so I'm not a particularly tall guy, but I have to say, I mean, even the driver's compartment, I struggled to get in there. I mean, fantastic. And from a silhouette point of view, I mean, presenting, you know, the shape of the vehicle to present to the enemy was fantastic. Low silhouette, so really, really good. But I have to say, not a comfy vehicle at all. I'm proud to say we did get airtime on the T-72. That was the Czech variant CZ.
So looking at, again, other things that go into sort of, you know, things that obviously the game's not going to give you. Well, there we go, that'll be the next thing. You're going to start giving people drivers controls and little seats and boxes they have to sit in.
Going back to that simulator question, I think, David.
Yeah, so that idea there, but so many things come into play when you're actually judging a tank. And obviously in the game, there's one bit of it we're seeing there, you know, the King Tiger being swamped by all the other tanks there at the end. That sense of tanks against tanks, but also when judging a tank, you know, someone who served in a vehicle, you're obviously going to say that was a great tank, and it might be just because the ergonomics, how you could work, the way you could communicate, you didn't get wet every time you went through that puddle, etc. That's going to make your judgment of it a very different thing.
But of course, we also forget about when people ask, you know, what's the best tank? It's incredibly hard to say. I mean, unless you are somebody who's actually, yeah, of course, you know, I love Challenger 2 because I've been to war on Challenger 2 and I was trained on Challenger 2 and I haven't had the benefit of being in all these other vehicles and spending a lot of time in there. So yes, to me, it was of course course, a good tank. And of course, let's not forget, we're fundamentally very proud of our respective countries. So, you know, British design, British built.
Well, I was coming back to that. So that earlier question, someone asked about the Sherman and everything. Actually, the Sherman worked perfectly for the American way they wanted to fight the war. Even if, individually, as a tank crewman, you might found it hard work in a Sherman if you thought you were at the losing end of a Panther over the other side of the field, etc. So that there's who's judging, who's making that judgment about what the best tank is. And we talked about earlier, I was saying, you know, things like even Challenger 1, it looks such a good tank. Is that why I'm judging it? You know, just because the aesthetic somehow makes something, you know, again, we talked about that camouflage scheme, that late war. We've all get obsessed about German camouflage schemes on their vehicles. And what an irony, that scheme we're putting on the Jagdpanther that you can put on your World of Tanks game if you want, on your tank there, if you want to buy that and support the Tank Museum. But that is because they're running out of paint. And yet there was all of us admiring, model makers, everybody else, thinking the Germans were just being really, really clever about their design, when actually it was expediency because they didn't have enough paint to do the whole vehicle in the ways they would have liked. Anyway, right. So we've looked at our...
I think we've got time for a question for you.
Fine, let's
fire. It's from, oh, this is very apt, Artie021 on Twitch. What is the biggest challenge when restoring a tank, not including money?
Not
including money, yeah.
One thing I think is with everything is skill sets. People need to have, you know, you can have a great engineer, you can have an ex-serviceman, you can have all sorts of things, but it's having the empathy to how you're going to restore. So when is the time? We try desperately to keep that original component. With certain modern vehicles, you know, when they're in service, if this goes wrong, you take it off, you throw it away, or it's backloaded and you bung on a brand new pair. For us, sometimes that might be, number one, we can't replace it, and number two, if that was that component that was there with this tank in its service history at that battle at that time, that's part of the tank's significance, this word we use sometimes. So we try and do that. And it's getting everybody on board that that's what we're trying to achieve. So where are we trying to save things? And I'd recommend, again, look at our Matilda diaries, which takes you through the restoration of stories there and where these dilemmas come up and how we've debated internally. What do we save? What's worth replacing? How do we protect things? Paint schemes, etc. underneath. So all of those things come together. So sometimes it's money is vital, but it's also the skill sets and the mental attitude of the people doing that job. And obviously, you know, for the museum as well, you know, we haven't got all day, we haven't got limitless funds, limitless space and everything else. So that's another thing that has to come into play, a sense of urgency to get the job done with the resources available, but to a standard we can be proud of.
I have to say, some of the rest, I find it fascinating, the restorations across, but whether it's private collectors or museums and things, but the Wheel Foundation was one that I sort of like, I quite often visited because it seems to me there that the team, I mean, they have A, the money, and B, the time and the expertise to put into it there. But it's incredible, the detail. I always remember looking at a Sherman he was restoring when they were struggling to find the pencil that goes next to the commander. So it was just remarkable, the amount of detail that they go into it.
And again, you know, this debate could go on forever, but everyone's going to come at it with slightly different attitudes. You know, there's some restorations out there where the tank's better than it, and like aeroplanes as well, you know. They were never like that when they left the factory. It's too good. You see what I mean? And, you know, it was never in that condition. But who are we to judge on that one? All I would say is look at the organisations when you're going there and looking at these things, why people are doing different way, what are their resources, which is why some of these private individual people that are putting together a tank, we saw a Stug there done by John Phillips earlier, you know, fantastic that they can do that. So also watch your teeth when you walk up to him and say it's in the wrong colour afterwards, because quite rightly he is not going to have time for people, or as I was saying earlier, show us yours, what have you done then? Because just make sure that when you're approaching people and looking at these things, any private person, you know, yes, of course you're welcome to your opinion, etc., but just careful how you express it when that person's put all that time and energy into something. So,
okay, moving on then, David. We're at our last Tanks in Action, actually. So we're back to you with post and Cold War Tanks in Action. We're then going straight away from there to our final three museums. So we've got the US Army Armour and Cavalry Collection, the National Military Museum in partnership with the Historic Collection of the Royal Netherlands Army. There's a mouthful and a half. And then we're going to finish off with the Austrian Army Museum.
Okay. Now again, here we've got one of those vehicles, we're really lucky. This is a JS3 or IS3, Joseph Stalin tank. KV-1 family, the Russians, as we mentioned earlier, they were aware of these heavier German tanks coming, so they started building on what was originally the KV family of vehicles. KV-1, very small numbers. KV-2 sees action at the end of the war. This tank doesn't see action before the war ends, but is used in the victory parade. And leading on to the T-10 tank, this is a tank that frightens the West. What you've got is a very well designed armour protection, the low hull, the frying pan shaped turret, and here as well the idea that behind it, the D25 122mm gun, you're looking there at a gun that has got 5 times the muscle or the muzzle energy coming out the end of that barrel compared to the earlier 76mm gun that was on the original T-34. So hugely powerful gun there and a frightening tank. Now this tank, many of you looking at it, you might think this is a T-54. The T-54 is a tank that is designed just at the end of the Second World War, some of the first variants. They do a model called the T-44 that was going to be a replacement for the original T-34 tank. They decide not to build it in large numbers and they improve on the T-34 to make the T-34-85. But they get parts of the T-44 as good designs, the wider tracks, that sloped front glacé plate, the frying pan shaped turret as we call it, and ended up, and that goes on to the T-54 and later the T-55 tank. Now this particular model that's driving around on the screen at the moment, this is actually a Chinese copy of the T-54 tank. When the Soviets, the Red Army, the Soviet government was friendly with Mao and the Chinese government, they handed over the plans, and so the Chinese, Norinco Industries, build a copy, and that is called the Type 59. And that's what the tank driving around there was. Now, this is the British Centurion tank. Centurion just misses the end of the Second World War. Operation Sentry, they send out Centurion tanks out to Germany, misses the end of the war by about 6 weeks. And you can see now that Britain has done away with that stepped front with the, as we saw earlier, with the Comet tank, the Beezer machine gun. We've got rid of it and got that smooth front glacé plate. We've put on the gun. We start with a 17-pounder, then a 20-pounder, then a 105mm gun. And here's an illustration. You can keep improving the Centurion. That was the great thing about it. And this is an improved Swedish version, new engine in the back, add-on armour, reactive armour there as well you've got. And this was in service, that type of Centurion, for many years later. Centurion's still in service with the South Africans, called the Oliphant. Recovery versions, so a whole family of vehicles were based on the Centurion hull. So Mark II recovery tank, later model Centurion driving around there with the searchlight on the side. And that was the great thing about the tank. You could keep improving on it. 13 marks in British Army service. Now, when the German Army reformed in 1955 after World War II, they end up, first of all, using American tanks, and then they start a design program for their own vehicle, which they initially called the Standard Panzer. And first of all, they're working with the French. Like so many post-war cooperations, lots of good ideas, goes well, till finally there's a falling out about design criteria. So the Germans go alone and they come up with this, the Leopard 1. And it's a real change from that design philosophy of the late war heavy tanks like the King Tiger. Here they've gone for thin armour, good firepower, that's a British 105mm gun there, and they've gone for speed. So they put a thumping great MTU diesel engine in the back there, and that gives this vehicle mobility. The Germans at the time had the philosophy that pretty much if you're going to get hit, it's going to penetrate you. Don't get hit in the first place. Make sure you are so mobile, so quick around the battlefield that you are not going to be a target for the enemy. And the speed is a defence mechanism in itself. Now this particular Leopard 1 is actually, if you look on the turret, little maple leaf just above where the gun is there. That's because it's served with the Canadian Defence Forces. The Canadians bought Leopards, lots of countries bought Leopards after they got rid of their Centurion, so it became almost like a European tank. Now the Americans, after the Second World War, they do a family of vehicles that are often called the pattern tanks. M47, M48, this is the M60. And very similar design criteria, but they just seem to get bigger. And here you've got this huge, great cast turret, great big cast hull there, and again that use of the British 105mm L7 gun. The reason for the L7 gun, everyone uses it because all of a sudden it becomes, a gun comes into play that means some of the bigger 120mm guns are redundant and firing discarding salvo ammunition. This is a gun that can do so many roles that different guns did before. So most of the Western Allies end up using the variants of the L7 gun. Here you can see it's got a boat-shaped hull. We're used to seeing V-shaped hull nows. The idea behind that was that if a mine went off, the blast went up the sides. And here's a bit, what your neck of the woods, a favourite for you here, isn't it?
Well, certainly this takes me back a bit. I mean, the next three tanks, I think, are tanks that I actually physically served on. This was the one that I, back in the 1980s, the very famous Cold War tank, the Chieftain, the FE 4201. This is when I actually learnt everything on tanking. So my very first trade was on this particular vehicle, and that first trade was that of a gunner. Some would argue, rightly or wrongly, that it was the best tank of that particular period. Certainly the firepower was fantastic. The 120mm rifle gun, incredibly accurate, and very, very good indeed. Good armour protection all over, especially the glacier's plate as well. The thing that let it down, and everybody would say that when you think of Chieftain, was the reliability of Chieftain. Chieftain was not a reliable vehicle. In fact, early stages of the Chieftain design, there was 1.90% breakdowns reported on Chieftain. And I have to say, from actually serving on it, that's a pretty accurate figure, to be perfectly honest. I don't recall many times whether we took it out on up the road to practice going into a hide or something, it would break down. And certainly when I got on later life and became a driver, I'd spend a lot of time with my head in the back decks. So late 1980s, we needed a replacement, and it was all about the reliability of Chieftain. Along came Challenger 1 later on, got redesignated of course, but Challenger initially. And it was like going from a Volkswagen Beetle to a Ferrari as far as we were concerned in the tank world. It was fantastic, and the most noticeable difference was that of the driving of it. I think even from the video you can see the speed compared to that of the Chieftain is quite remarkable. And you know, we don't talk a lot about crew comfort and things really out there, but it makes a difference, but also it makes a tactical difference. With the hydropneumatic suspension, which we now had on Challenger 1, it meant that firing on the move was a lot easier than it ever was on Chieftain. On Chieftain, you get these horrible clunky gear changes in between. So as a gunner on a Challenger 1, it was a lot easier to accurately fire on the move. And this was the period when firing on the move was all the way through. And later on, of course, then we came to Challenger 2. A fantastic vehicle, but of course I think we spoke about this a bit earlier. Not that I'm biased in any way, shape or form. Some of the major differences, why it's called Challenger 2, well, it's a bit of a sort of question up for discussion as really. It's only about 3% of the parts are actually interchangeable with Challenger 1. So for all intents and purposes, it was a brand new vehicle. Hydrogas suspension, where the key signature features on there for identification purposes, you look above the barrel, you've got a thermal observation and gunnery system. This was then enabled us, it came later on certainly Chieftain, better on Chieftain 1, but it was by the time Chieftain 2, it was home to a fine art, the thermal observation site, and it meant identifying targets for us was so much easier. And it wasn't just all about engaging at night, although that was of course possible now. It also meant that we can actually pick up heat signatures from vehicles in the distance as well, so it was a very, very good thing to see.
This footage, sorry, I've just got to interrupt you here, because we were up there and just seeing that. One of the things as well, individual tank on tank, when we were there and you see those tanks moving, the shock and awe, just the noise, firing on the move, I was just amazed at the speed they were going. That's one of those other things that you imagine if you're on the receiving end of that, there is an awe about a tank coming towards you, you know, that very little other few things, you know, maybe a fast jet flying low. But, yeah, and here we go. So T-72 is what the sort of thing might have been if the Cold War had become hot, you guys would have been up against.
This was all about our AFE recognition, was always about the T-72 V-shaped glaciers plate, etc., etc. I was actually fortunate enough to drive one of these in the CZ, the Czech variant of the T-72. A great vehicle. I mean, a really, really good vehicle. As I said, for us, it was the arch enemy. There was always a comment about sort of, in particular, going back to Chieftain versus these Soviet vehicles, was that Chieftain was a fantastic vehicle as long as it broke down in a good fire position. So the T-72 I absolutely loved. It's a low profile. It's very, very effective. It is what it is. It does what it says on the tin, the T-72.
Well, good day, TANKFEST fans. I hope you're enjoying the program today. My name's Rob Kogan, and I'm the curator at the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection at Fort Benning, Georgia. Our mission is to preserve and conserve the armor branch history. That doesn't just include armored fighting vehicles like the ones behind me, but also going back to the horse cavalry days. Our collection consists of quite a various assortment of vehicles, all the way back to the earliest tanks of World War I, probably the largest collection of World War I vehicles in North America. Then going into World War II, besides, of course, having American tanks like the Sherman, which we have quite a selection of behind me, we also have quite a fascinating collection of German tanks and tank destroyers, all captured by U.S. forces in combat during World War II. Probably very fascinating to some of our fans out there, we have a very good selection of prototype vehicles, probably the most famous, of course, being the T-28 Super Heavy tank, as well as other prototypes throughout the last 100 years. So when the Tank Museum approached us and asked us to feature a vehicle on the move for everybody for TANKFEST Online, of course, I wanted to pick something that was all-American. And of course, first that comes to mind, of course, Sherman tank, such a classic American design, but usually in the past, the Tank Museum has usually had at least one running Sherman on display for TANKFEST, so I wanted to pick something different. So luckily for you, because we are located here with the United States Army Armor School at Fort Benning, we have a special treat today. For you, on the move, we have the M1 Abrams main battle tank.
So earlier on we saw the M60. When the Americans started a project they called MBT-70, it was a joint project with the Germans that again became too expensive, too technologically advanced, didn't quite work, so that was scrapped, and they then start the XM1 project, which leads to the Abrams. And as part of that, first of all they look at the British gun. They know they want to put a 120mm gun on the tank when it goes into production later on, so early M1s end up with the British 105, later models with a 120mm gun. But issues as well with the, interestingly, the American design team on a trip to Britain, they're shown Burlington, which is a new secret armour that's being put together, and we haven't actually put it on a British tank yet. But that's shared, so that goes on to what becomes the Abrams tank. And again, engineering-wise, one of the interesting things about Abrams, 120mm gun, new type of laminate armour, but they also use the gas turbine engine, which again was a big radical departure. And you've seen these things in operation, haven't you? They're quite impressive bits of kit, and they can motor.
We did a couple of exchange visits with the Americans, where we obviously got to actually drive a few of these, and also, of course, in the last Gulf War, when we actually worked alongside them. I have to say, you mentioned the gas turbine is the most distinctive feature, and the sound of the gas turbine, you will never forget it once you've ever heard it. Driving the vehicle, unbelievable. It's the acceleration, because of that gas turbine engine, is absolutely fantastic. It's astronomical.
They actually have to put limiters on, don't they? Because you could probably shake the vehicle apart, sort of thing. So the only thing now is, again, this is how tanks in service for this amount of time, they've gone through enormous upgrades, and you'll see that, you know, and urban operations upgrades for Tusk, for example. They're going through, they're still upgrading, they're still putting Abrams tanks through the factories. That idea that a tank that's been that long in service, but one of the issues, of course, with the gas turbine, early days, America was not a country that was worried about fuel consumption. Now, amazingly, you know, these are issues that are affecting everybody. And a gas turbine, the downside of it is you're only going about half the distance with the fuel load that a diesel-powered vehicle on the similar fuel load will go. So that's one of those things that other countries are having a look at. Similarly on the S-Tank, you know, distinctive noise, much more powerful, smaller engine, that's great, but that's one of those problem things. Now I think here we can actually see them firing this 120 in there. I believe this is a training squadron we're looking at.
Yeah, they just wanted us to mention that as well. So the M1A2s and A1s that you see in this actually belong to the 194th Armour Brigade and the 316th Cavalry Brigade, and these units are the two training components in the US Armour School at Fort Benning in Georgia.
I really do hope you are enjoying today's program. I'd like to take a moment to thank the Tank Museum for inviting us to participate in TANKFEST Online this year. Hopefully next year we can make it out there again in person. And If you'd like to know more about what the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection is doing, please give us a like and follow on Facebook or on Twitter. We're also on there as well. And enjoy the rest of TANKFEST Online.
Welcome at the National Military Museum of the Netherlands, located at the former Soesterberg Air Base. My name is Alfred Staarman, Head of Collections, and this is our arsenal. By some considered as the biggest boys' toy box in the world. The museum displays all military equipment that the Royal Netherlands Army and Air Force have used over the years. Weapons, uniforms, artillery, vehicles, aircraft, and of course, tanks. The Sherman, the Chevy, the Centurion, the Leopard 2 A6, which is still in use by the Army today. In special exhibitions, we show foreign loans, such as this guest from Bovington you might recognize. It's a very rare King Tiger or König Tiger. It's a part of the exhibition in commemoration of the end of World War II, 75 years ago. We also show vehicles in our arena to demonstrate the roles for which they are intended. That means tanks in action. We do this together with our partners from the historical collection of the Royal Netherlands Army. This group of dedicated specialists and enthusiasts from the Army itself operate a large fleet of running historic vehicles. You might know them because they're also a regular participant at TANKFEST.
Tank Museum, because not only knowing Soesterberg and the collections there and working with Alfred, but also with the Royal Dutch Army or the Royal Netherlands Army, their historic collection. They have a stunning collection of vehicles that are used for things such as commemorative parades, events, historic events, and turning up at events at the museum so that they can drive around. And again, their restorers, the team they've got there, they're doing very, very well with them. They've come over here to TANKFEST, so we have a great chance to talk with them and exchange ideas, sometimes parts, sometimes all sorts of things can go on. So good relationship we've been built up with Bovington and the Dutch military. Now here you can see their Leopard 2 A4, and the chaps who are out there doing this evidently had a whale of a time with a drone on this particular day's filming. 2A4, so we mentioned already the Leopard 1. When the Germans, first of all, they go to try and have again another cooperative venture with the Americans to replace the original Leopard 1. When that doesn't really come to anything with the MBT-70 project we just talked about earlier with the Abrams, they go their own way and they go for Leopard 2. And what they've got here is a 120mm Rheinmetall gun, again an enlarged MTU engine, the diesel engine on the back there. And where the Germans were very clever with this vehicle, the Dutch, by the way, are some of the first to buy the Leopard 2 as well off the Germans. They keep that sense of mobility they've got with the Leopard 1 up, but they add to the protection levels with the Leopard 2. So you've got a very mobile vehicle with very good levels of protection, and again the powerful 120mm Rheinmetall gun. And I know you've actually had a closer look at these, Richard, haven't you? And
when we served in Germany, we used to work quite often obviously with the German Army, and yeah, it is one of my favourite vehicles of all time. The reliability is fantastic, and it's a real tank. Now what I mean by that is it's good for the crew. It's pretty robust. It means that when you're tired, you've been on exercise for a few days, you're not going to put your foot in the wrong place and break something inside the turret. So the crews absolutely love it. And of course it comes in a wide variety of variants all over the place, been updated and modernised, but certainly one of the most impressive things I ever saw was a pack lift. So changing the engine on one of these, which they managed to do ridiculously quick time. It's only like 40 odd minutes or something, which was so quick. So a superb vehicle and very well designed.
So the Dutch, again, one of those nations that got rid of its tanks, amazingly, like so many, Canada did as well, European countries as well, got rid of the tanks. Next moment they needed them back. So they've actually now, I think they rent, or they're actually acquiring off the Germans they served with them, now the Leopard 2 A6, the one with the pointed front turret. So tanks are back with the Dutch Army.
Under normal circumstances, we would have organized a tank show here in this arena in August, together with our partners from the historical collection of the Army. But because of the situation, we had to cancel that event. We hope to see you all some other time. For more information, please visit our website nmm.nl or follow us on Facebook, Instagram or YouTube. Thank you, Bovington, for the opportunity to be your guest today.
Hello from the Austrian Army Museum in Vienna. We are one of the oldest military museums in the world, and the museum was built in the 1850s. It opened in 1872, and the building is in neoclassic Greek-inspired style and contains collections from the 1600s until today. The first exhibition was made of the weapons and trophy collections of the emperors of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. From the 30 Years' War to the Napoleonic Wars, the history of the Austrian soldier is told. One of the most interesting objects in the museum is, of course, of European importance, the car and the uniform of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914. The exhibition about World War I tells stories of mountain warfare and the horrors of the trench war against Russia. The museum contains also a collection of the Austrian Navy until 1918. The Austrian Army of the Republic from 1919 to 1938 is presented together with the exhibition about World War II from 1939 to 1945. The Today's Austrian Army was created in 1955, and the exhibition about the new army goes until 1991. The recently opened Tank Hall presents 36 running armored fighting vehicles, starting with the idea of Lieutenant Burstein's motorized gun in 1912 to the main battle tank Leopard 2 A4 of the modern Austrian army.
So here we've got a tank that many of you, I imagine if you looked at it from a distance, first of all you're going to say something like, oh, it's a French AMX-13. What you're looking at is actually, it's not an AMX-13. It's an Austrian version of a vehicle that they call the cuirassier, basically named after the cavalry, you know, when you saw the guy with his breastplate and his sword. So it's a tank that, first of all, they get the first set of turrets actually come from France, from the AMX-13. It's what they call that oscillating turret, so the whole top goes up and down with the gun, and it's basically a medium pressure 105mm gun they put on it. And they use for the hull, it's actually a Steyr-built Austrian armoured personnel carrier. And the advantage here is you've actually got a powerful gun that could be a tank destroying gun on a very light chassis. And again, one of the other things we talked about, you know, just the idea of bigger's better all the time. Yes, it might be in terms of protection levels, but this is a tank that is very mobile. It is light enough. It's only about 8 tons, or 18 tons, sorry. It can go in the back of a Hercules, and it can be transported around the place. And again, think of Austria, some of the terrains, getting a big heavy tank to some of the locations is not going to be easy. So here's one of those innovation vehicles that, again, in Austria, they ended up building about 284 of them. They went out of service some years ago. They were upgraded first of all, so they had an A1 and then an A2 model, but they went out of service in about 2006. The tank you're looking at is actually the last of the tanks that was in service with the Austrian Army, but they had an on sale, and these are now vehicles that have gone to Morocco, Tunisia, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, even Botswana's got them in service, and some countries have upgraded their own ones again. So when we're looking at a vehicle like this, it's another important thing to remember. Yes, we like those bigger, heavier vehicles all the time, but for some countries, just having some form of armoured fighting vehicle with a good quality gun on it, that's going to give you a winning position. So that's worth thinking about here. And we've actually got France, who was introducing the Austrian Military Museum there earlier. He's actually crewing this. He was a tank crewman himself, and I think he ended up on Leopards that were there as well. So this is one of those vehicles that may make you think it's an AMX-13, but no, it's not. It's an indigenous conversion by the Austrians, and there you can see the Austrian flag, and I was very careful earlier on to pick up the fact that's the army symbol in the middle of the Austrian flag there as this vehicle drives along.
see you in the oldest military museum of the world, because wars belongs to museums.
Sworn you just show me that AMX, David. Of course it is.
So we've got to thank all those museums that have put forward their videos. Again, go back to tankfest.org and you can have a look there at links to their sites. Do have a look, and if you've got the opportunity, look, you've just seen yourselves there, if you've watched all those, the range of vehicles that they house. Their collections, not just, I mean, look at that Vienna one. We haven't been there, have we? We definitely need an invite to Vienna, I think.
It looks stunning, absolutely stunning.
So thank you there to Rob Kogan out in America, Alfred, who's out in Holland, so well done, Alfred, and Franz, you know, thank you so much again for providing those films for us. I mentioned that because, again, come back to what are we doing all this for? Please do, if you've got an opportunity of supporting those museums, supporting our museum. We can't put on TANKFEST this year, sorry about that. We are going to open the museum. Someone asked a question earlier. We are going to be opening on July the 6th. And one of the things that we just wanted to say, go to the website, because we can't open, the galleries will be open, but we won't be opening everything, and you will have to pre-book. So go to the website to find out all that information first of all. And also, please follow up as well, because we've got things like gold membership. If you want to become a member and pop in the Tank Museum anytime you like, as it were. We've got the Patreon scheme, so please go and have a look at that. We've got all our wonderful products that are on sale. And I know World of Tanks has been supporting, so you're still pushing that paint scheme for the Jag Panther. And hopefully next week there'll be more of the Tiger 131s you can buy for getting in the game. And look at, subscribe on our YouTube channel, because again, there's another way that you can get this sort of information on a regular basis. So please do follow up on all of that. And I think we've got another question or two left.
I have got another question, but just to finish off on the World of Tanks side, like you said, David, please remember, go across. Some of the camo still for sale up there. Go and get it. Proceeds are going to the museum as well. The bundles, we will give you a shout when they are back up for sale again in limited numbers. But from us to you, David, in particular, thank you so much for this. It's been educational and informative all the way through to your team as well. Thank you very much. And really, at a personal level, as a retired veteran tanker, thank you for keeping the message alive for everybody. So it's super important to us. And I know the guys in the Royal Tank Regiment will be extremely grateful for everything you and all your volunteers do down here.
Well, that comes back to, so when you come back to the Tank Museum, it's these guys' stories we tell. So that business about, we've got the kit around, I would argue all the time, it's the personal stories that you want to know about. That's what engages so often. So if people do have that opportunity, our new World War II displays, you know, come and have a look at those when you've got the chance to come back, because that's telling the tank soldier's story as well as showing off these amazing bits of machinery that we've been seeing today, like the kit behind us. Thank you. Sorry, did we have a question?
I've got a perfect end question for you.
Yeah, far away.
So if you want to say anything else, say it first. But the end question I've got for you, and I'm not sure if this was made up or anything, a question from Free Jan on YouTube. Is the museum beer any good? What about that for a closing question?
So there you go. So what we've got everything from Kobe Tiger tanks, if you want to make a model of our 131, that's you know, kind of one of these brick ones and everything. But we've got everything, top trump tanks, we've got the books, I've been telling you about the books, buy your Tank Museum calendar. But for the discerning male and female, I'm told these days, you can buy yourself some Tank Museum beer. And I've opened a bottle and I've poured a little bit out. I did that earlier so I didn't get it all over our laps like I did last time I tried it. So here's some of our Little Willie beer. We've got Tiger beer. We've got all sorts of different beers available. You can even get a Centurion beer. So I'm going to say thank you very, very much to all of you for supporting us. Please carry on, you know, look at the websites. We're going to be going on afterwards back to World of Tanks in a moment. But for those of you who have bought something and helped us today, thanks very, very much indeed. Thank you for the support of World of Tanks. Do keep supporting us and all those other museums that are partaking, because we're going to need your support after this COVID-19 mess is all over and done with, because it's only by you coming that we can keep doing things. So Well done, everybody. And I'm going to finish off by, let's have a slurp of our little Willy beer. And here's to you, and thank you very much, Richard.
Cheers, everybody at home. Thanks for joining us, and we're going back to the studio. Thanks, David.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Ikibu. Thank you so much to the Tanky Museum. Thank you so much to Richard and David Willey for hosting an epic part of that. I just need to click on the right bits going on in there. Thank you much, everybody, for watching. Joining